I live in a quiet neighborhood where everyone keeps to themselves. My street is full of retirees, young couples, and the occasional yappy dog. So when the U-Haul pulled up at the end of the block one Saturday morning, it turned more heads than usual. The man who moved in was odd. Early 30s, tall and wiry, with thick black hair that always looked slightly wet. He wore the same faded hoodie every day, no matter how hot it got, and his smile was too wide, like he didn't know how to stop. He introduced himself as Owen. "Hi there," he said, extending a hand that hung in the air just a moment too long. "New to the area. Hope I can fit in." Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl, but I smiled, shook his clammy hand, and welcomed him to the neighborhood. At first, Owen seemed harmless. Sure, he was awkward. He had a habit of standing too close when he talked to you, and his jokes never quite landed. But he wasn't unfriendly. He'd wave at me when I was out mowing the lawn, ask about the weather when we passed on the sidewalk. But then I started noticing things. The first was his car. He didn't have one, which isn't unusual on its own. Plenty of people don't drive. But every night, around 3 a.m., I'd hear the sound of an engine rumbling outside his house. When I peeked out the window, there'd be a dark, windowless van parked in his driveway, its headlights off. It never stayed for more than a few minutes, and I never saw who got in or out. The second thing was his house. He never opened the curtains. Ever. Day or night, his windows were always covered, and there was no sign of life inside. No TV glow, no lights flicking on or off. But sometimes, late at night, I'd see shadows moving behind the curtains. Sharp, jittery movements, like someone pacing back and forth. The last thing, though, was what made me start keeping my distance. One evening, I was taking the trash out when I saw Owen standing at the edge of his driveway, staring at something in the gutter. He was holding a plastic bag, the kind you get at the grocery store, but it was dripping. "Hey," I called out. "Everything okay?" He didn't answer right away, just stood there, frozen, his head tilted slightly like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. Then, without turning around, he said, "It's still alive, you know." "What?" I asked, confused. Owen turned to face me. His smile stretched so wide it made my stomach churn. "The things you throw away, they don't die." "Not really." I laughed nervously, not sure how to respond. He gave a short, jerky wave and walked back into his house, leaving a trail of red droplets behind him. I avoided him after that, but Owen didn't seem to take the hint. He started showing up unexpectedly, knocking on my door to borrow sugar, standing in my yard to compliment my hydrangeas. Once, I came home to find him sitting on my porch swing, humming a tune I didn't recognize. "Hope you don't mind," he said cheerfully. "I was just enjoying the evening air." That night, I locked every door and window in the house. Then the letters started. At first, they were innocuous. Folded pieces of notebook paper slipped under my door, with messages like, "Beautiful moon tonight," or "Hydrangeas are blooming nicely." But they grew stranger. "I saw you watching the van. Curious, aren't you? It's not about what you throw away. It's what comes back." The last note I got was 3 words, written in thick black marker. "Come see me." Against my better judgment, I went. It was late, probably past midnight, and the street was silent. Owen's house looked the same as ever. Dark, lifeless, curtains drawn. I hesitated at the door, but before I could knock, it creaked open on its own. "Owen?" I called out, stepping inside. The air smelled faintly of damp earth, like a basement or a graveyard after rain. The walls were lined with shelves, but instead of books or knickknacks, they were filled with jars. Hundreds of them, each one murky and full of something. I moved closer to one of the jars, holding my phone flashlight up to the glass. Inside was a cluster of small, writhing shapes, too many legs, too many eyes. "You came," Owen's voice said behind me. I spun around, nearly dropping my phone. He was standing in the doorway, his hoodie damp and clinging to his skin. His smile was gone, replaced by an expression I couldn't read, something between excitement and hunger. "What is all this?" I demanded, gesturing to the jars. He tilted his head, like he was surprised I had to ask. "The things we discard," he said. "The things we pretend don't exist." They come back, you know. They always come back. Before I could respond, there was a noise, soft at first, like distant thunder. It grew louder, sharper, until the walls seemed to tremble with it. The jars began to rattle, their contents writhing faster. "You shouldn't have come here," Owen said, his voice low. I didn't wait to find out what he meant. I bolted for the door, not stopping until I was back in my house. Every light on, every lock turned. That was 2 weeks ago. Since then, things have been different. My trash can never stays full, no matter how much I throw away. My hydrangeas have started wilting, their petals falling off in jagged, unnatural shapes. And last night, I found a jar sitting on my front porch. It was empty, but not for long. I wasn't even looking for one. I was at this junk shop on the outskirts of town, just killing time. The place smelled like mildew and old wood, the kind of store where the shelves are crammed with forgotten odds and ends. Mismatched silverware, dusty books, vintage toys with chipped paint. I wandered toward the back, and that's when I saw it. The mirror was huge, at least 6 feet tall, with an ornate, black frame carved into swirling, almost organic patterns. It looked heavy, ancient. Something about it drew me in. The glass wasn't pristine. It had faint scratches and a slightly cloudy surface, but that only added to its charm. The price tag said $50, which seemed ridiculously cheap for something that impressive. Where'd this come from? I asked the guy behind the counter. He shrugged. Estate sale, I think. You want it? I hesitated. I didn't need a mirror. But standing there, looking into its warped surface, I felt this pull, like it was waiting for me. Yeah, I said. I'll take it. It took some effort to get the thing home. It barely fit in the back of my car, but eventually, I managed to wrestle it into my apartment. I propped it up in the corner of my bedroom, too lazy to hang it properly. For the first few days, it was just a mirror. It reflected the room, the soft glow of my bedside lamp, the messy pile of laundry I kept meaning to put away. Nothing special. But then, small things started happening. The first time I noticed something was off, it was subtle. I walked past the mirror on my way to the bathroom and caught a glimpse of movement in the glass. Not my own reflection. It was something else, just a flicker in the corner of my eye. I stopped and stared at the mirror, but everything looked normal. I chalked it up to my imagination. A few nights later, I woke up to a faint tapping sound. It was soft, irregular, like someone lightly rapping their knuckles against a table. At first, I thought it was coming from the window, but when I got up to check, I realized the sound was coming from the mirror. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The tapping stopped as soon as I stepped closer. I stood there, staring into the glass, my reflection dimly lit by the moonlight streaming through the blinds. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw it. A hand. It wasn't mine. It wasn't even in the same position as mine. My reflection was still, but in the glass, a pale, slender hand pressed against the inside of the mirror, fingers splayed. It was faint, almost translucent, but it was there. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. When I looked again, the hand was gone. I wanted to get rid of the mirror right then and there, but some part of me couldn't. It wasn't just fear holding me back, it was curiosity. The same pull I'd felt in the shop was stronger now, almost insistent. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, or maybe I was dreaming. I could have sworn I'd woken up, but dreams can be convincing, right? The next night, I decided to test it. I set up my phone on a tripod, pointing it at the mirror. Then I sat on the bed, facing the glass, and hit record. Nothing happened for hours. I sat there, my reflection staring back at me, until my eyelids grew heavy and I drifted off. When I woke up, the room was silent. The mirror was the same as always, just a mirror. I grabbed my phone and played back the recording, fast-forwarding through the footage. For most of it, there was nothing, just me, sitting there, and eventually lying down. But around the 3-hour mark, the screen flickered. I rewound and played it again. The flicker wasn't a glitch. It was movement. A shadow passed through the glass, dark and sinuous, like smoke curling against the surface. I rewound again, slowing the playback. The shadow moved across the mirror, and then a face appeared. It wasn't my face. The face in the mirror was gaunt, with hollow eyes and a mouth stretched into a faint, unnatural smile. It leaned closer to the glass, watching me as I slept. Then, slowly, it raised one hand and tapped against the inside of the mirror. 3 times. The video cut off after that. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By morning, I'd made up my mind to get rid of the mirror. I called a friend with a truck and begged him to help me take it back to the junk shop. When we arrived, though, the store was closed. The windows were boarded up and the sign was gone, like it had never existed. I ended up leaving the mirror on the curb, hoping someone else would take it. I didn't care anymore. I just wanted it gone. That was 3 days ago. Last night, I came home to find the mirror back in my bedroom. It was propped up in the same corner, its surface spotless, as if I'd never moved it. And now, as I write this, I can hear the tapping again. 3 soft knocks, coming from inside the glass. I don't want to look, but I can feel it watching me. It's waiting. I didn't plan to move to Ridgewood. Nobody does. It's one of those towns you only end up in when something goes wrong, like a divorce or losing your job. For me, it was both. My ex took the house, my career fell apart, and the only rental I could afford was a tiny, run-down apartment in a crumbling building on the outskirts of Ridgewood. The building had a name once, but the faded letters above the entrance had long since peeled off, leaving only shadowy outlines. The landlord, Mr. Gray, was ancient and disheveled, with watery blue eyes that darted around like he expected something to leap out at him. "You're in 2C, he said as he handed me the key. His voice was raspy, as if he'd spent years inhaling smoke or secrets. "Don't talk to the woman in 4A. I blinked, sure I hadn't heard him right. "What?" He waved me off with a bony hand. "Just don't. And don't ask questions. Rent's due on the 1st. That should have been my first clue that Ridgewood was a mistake. But I was desperate and tired, so I ignored the warning. My apartment was fine. Small, but clean enough, with a window overlooking the alley. It smelled faintly of damp carpet and old paint, but I could live with it. The first few days passed without incident. The other tenants mostly kept to themselves, nodding politely in the hallways or stairwells, but never lingering long enough for a real conversation. It wasn't until the 3rd night that I heard it. A faint knock on my door, so soft it could have been my imagination. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. It was nearly midnight, and I hadn't met anyone in the building who seemed the type to make late-night social calls. After a moment, I crept to the peephole and peered out. The hallway was empty. I told myself it must have been a mistake, maybe someone knocking on the wrong door. But as I turned to go back to bed, I heard it again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. This time, I flung the door open. No one was there. I stepped into the hallway, scanning both directions. It was silent, the kind of silence that feels unnatural, as though the building itself were holding its breath. When I closed the door, I noticed something on the floor, a folded piece of paper. My name was written on the outside in delicate, looping script. Inside, the message was short and cryptic. "Don't look out the window at 3:33 a.m. I stared at the note, my mind racing. Was this a joke? Some kind of prank? I didn't know anyone in Ridgewood. Who would do this? I threw the note away and tried to sleep, but the words burned in my mind. At 3:30 a.m., I was still wide awake, staring at the ceiling. When the clock ticked to 3:33, I felt an almost magnetic pull toward the window, like a part of me had to see what was outside. I didn't want to look, but I did. At first, I saw nothing. Just the alley below, empty except for the trash cans and a lone street lamp flickering faintly. But then, in the corner of my vision, something moved. A figure was standing at the far end of the alley. They weren't walking or pacing, just standing there, perfectly still, facing my building. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't see their face, but I could feel their eyes on me, as if they knew I was watching. I slammed the curtain shut and backed away, my pulse racing. The next morning, I found another note on my doorstep. "You shouldn't have looked." I spent the day trying to rationalize it. Maybe one of the tenants was messing with me. Maybe it was just a coincidence. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. That night, the knocking came again, louder this time. 3 sharp raps, each one making me flinch. I didn't answer, didn't even move from the couch. Eventually, the knocking stopped, but I heard something else. A low, faint humming, like a melody just out of reach. It sounded like it was coming from above me, from 4A. I thought of Mr. Gray's warning. Don't talk to the woman in 4A. The next day, I asked one of the other tenants, a middle-aged man named Carl, about the woman in 4A. There's no one in 4A, he said flatly, his expression darkening. Hasn't been for years. Don't ask about her. He walked away before I could press him further. That night, the humming returned. It grew louder, more insistent, filling my apartment until it felt like it was vibrating through the walls. I couldn't take it anymore. I marched upstairs to 4A and pounded on the door. The humming stopped. I waited, my fist still poised to knock again. Slowly, the door creaked open, revealing a sliver of darkness. Hello? I called, my voice shaking. No response. I pushed the door open further, my hand fumbling for the light switch. The apartment was empty. No furniture, no signs of life. Just bare walls and a thick layer of dust covering the floor. But then I saw it. A mirror leaning against the far wall. It was enormous, with an ornate, gold frame that looked out of place in the otherwise barren room. As I stepped closer, I felt a chill creep up my spine. The reflection wasn't right. It showed the room behind me, but the details were wrong. Faded wallpaper, flickering candlelight, and a figure standing in the corner. I turned around quickly, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure had moved closer. It was a woman, her face pale and featureless, her head tilted as if studying me. And then she smiled. The last thing I remember is running back to my apartment, slamming the door and locking it. I didn't sleep that night, didn't even turn off the lights. The next morning, I went straight to Mr. Gray and told him I was moving out. He didn't argue, didn't ask why, just nodded like he'd been expecting it. As I loaded my car, I glanced up at the building one last time. She was standing in my window, watching me, and she was still smiling. A low, rhythmic tapping, barely audible over the hum of my old radiator. At first, I thought it was just the usual quirks of my apartment. You know how it is. Pipes groan, floors creak, walls settle. But this sound was different. It was deliberate, measured, like someone was gently tapping their fingers against the other side of my wall. I live on the 5th floor of a 6-story building in a quiet corner of the city. My neighbors, if you could call them that, kept to themselves. The man across the hall was a recluse who only emerged to retrieve food delivery, and the apartment next to mine was vacant. Or at least, I thought it was. The tapping started every night at exactly 11:17 p.m. Not a second before, not a second after. I checked. It was a soft, steady rhythm, like Morse code, but I didn't know enough to decipher it. I ignored it at first, assuming it was some harmless quirk of the building. But it didn't stop. By the 4th night, it had wormed its way under my skin. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, counting the taps. They always came in sets of 3. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't until the 5th night that I decided to knock back. I was half asleep when the tapping started again, and in my groggy frustration, I rapped my knuckles against the wall. 3 quick taps. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a single, deliberate tap responded. I froze, my pulse spiking. My hand hovered in the air, unsure whether to knock again or pretend it hadn't happened. Before I could decide, there was another sound. A faint, muffled voice coming through the wall. Hello? It was soft, almost hesitant, like the voice of someone who wasn't sure if they'd been heard. I scrambled out of bed, my heart racing, pressing my ear to the wall. I held my breath and waited. Hello? The voice came again, clearer this time. It sounded close, too close, like they were standing on the other side of the plaster. Who's there? I asked, my voice shaky. No response. I waited a full minute, my ear pressed against the cold wall, but the silence was absolute. The tapping didn't come back that night, and eventually, I fell into a restless sleep. The next day, I told myself I'd imagined it. Maybe I was overtired, Or maybe the sound had been something else entirely. I'd been living alone for too long, and my brain was playing tricks on me. That was the logical explanation. But logic had no place in what happened next. That evening, I came home from work to find a sticky note on my front door. It was bright yellow, and the handwriting was cramped and uneven, as though it had been written in a hurry. "Don't answer them." I stood there in the hallway, my keys dangling from my hand, staring at the note. The words felt like a warning, but they didn't make sense. Who was them? The voice? The taps? I looked around, hoping to spot someone who might have left the note, but the hallway was empty. When I turned back, a chill ran down my spine. The sticky note wasn't where I'd left it. It was now on the floor, flipped over. They're not what they seem. I didn't sleep that night. The tapping returned, louder and more insistent than before. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythm was different this time, more erratic, and it came from multiple points along the wall. I stayed in bed, clutching the covers like a shield, but then the voice returned. "Please," it whispered. "Help me." My breath caught. "Who are you?" I whispered back, my voice trembling. "Trapped," the voice said. "I'm trapped." The desperation in its tone made my stomach twist. It sounded human, pleading, but there was something off about it. An undercurrent of something too sharp, too deliberate. Against my better judgment, I pressed my hands to the wall. How are you trapped?" Silence. Then the tapping resumed, but this time, it wasn't on the wall. It was coming from inside my closet. I bolted upright, staring at the closet door. It was closed, but the sound was unmistakable. Tap, tap, tap. Slow and deliberate, as though someone, or something, was inside. I should have run. I should have grabbed my keys and left the apartment, but I didn't. Instead, I crept toward the door, my heart pounding so hard I could barely hear the tapping anymore. My hand shook as I reached for the handle. Before I could touch it, the door creaked open on its own. There was nothing inside. No clothes, no shoes, not even the boxes I'd stuffed in there months ago. Just an empty, yawning space that stretched far beyond the dimensions of the closet. It was a tunnel, dark and endless, lined with the same faded wallpaper that covered the walls of my apartment. And then I saw them. Eyes. Countless eyes, glowing faintly in the dark, staring at me from the depths of the tunnel. The voice came again, but this time it was everywhere. Inside my head, outside my head, vibrating through the walls. "Let us out." I slammed the closet door and ran, but the tapping didn't stop. It followed me, echoing through the apartment, the hallway, even the stairwell as I fled. I haven't been back since. I'm writing this from a motel across town, but I know it's not over. The tapping followed me here. It's faint now, like it's waiting for me to let my guard down. I don't think it's a person. I don't think it ever was. The town of Keldridge wasn't on any map. I know because I checked later, checked every atlas, every online satellite view. But that night, it was there, like it had always been, waiting for me. I wish I'd kept driving, but the gas light had been on for miles, and the storm was turning the highway into a slick, black mirror. When I saw the faded wooden sign for Keldridge, Pop 246, I turned off the main road without thinking. The place didn't look like much at first. Just a single street lined with crumbling brick buildings and a few houses set back from the road. The gas station sat on the edge of town, its lights flickering weakly in the downpour. A single pump stood beneath a rusted awning, and a small convenience store crouched behind it, its windows fogged with condensation. I pulled in, shutting off the engine and listening to the tick-tick-tick of the cooling metal. The rain hammered the roof, drowning out the uneasy silence of the town. Grabbing my wallet, I dashed into the store, the bell over the door jangling as I stepped inside. The man behind the counter looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took me in. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with a face like worn leather and a cigarette dangling from his lips. "Pumps cash only," he said without preamble, jerking his thumb toward an ancient register. "No cards, no receipts." I handed him a 20, too tired and soaked to argue. "Is there a diner or motel around here?" I asked, hoping to get some hot food and a few hours of sleep before getting back on the road. The man didn't answer right away. He glanced toward the window, where the rain streaked down in uneven lines, and his expression tightened. Diners closed. Motel burned down a while back. You'd be better off moving on. His tone was flat, dismissive, like he wanted me gone. But I wasn't going anywhere with an empty tank. I'll just fill up and see if I can find a spot to park for the night, I said, forcing a smile. He didn't smile back. Suit yourself. The gas pump worked slower than any pump I'd ever used, the numbers ticking upward at a glacial pace. As I waited, I noticed how still the town was. No cars, no movement, no sound except the rain. The houses lining the street had dark windows, their interiors hidden behind thick curtains. A single streetlight cast a feeble glow over the road, its buzzing hum the only other noise. When the tank was finally full, I decided to drive around a bit, looking for a safe spot to pull over. The town stretched on farther than it seemed at first glance, the houses growing sparser as the road curved toward a hill. That's when I saw the church. It loomed at the top of the hill, a dark silhouette against the stormy sky. The building was old, Victorian, maybe, with a spire that reached into the clouds. Its windows were lit with a dim orange glow, and as I got closer, I could see figures moving inside, their shadows flickering like moths around a flame. A funeral? A late-night prayer group? I couldn't say, but something about the scene made me uneasy. The figures weren't moving naturally. They swayed in unison, their heads tilted at odd angles, their arms hanging limply by their sides. I didn't want to stop, but my curiosity got the better of me. I pulled over just shy of the church and killed the engine. The rain had let up slightly, so I climbed out of the car, squinting up at the building. I could hear them now, soft, rhythmic chanting, a low drone that made my skin crawl. The words were indistinct, but the cadence was hypnotic, drawing me forward despite every instinct telling me to turn around. I crept closer, staying in the shadows, until I reached the edge of the churchyard. The chanting grew louder, and I could make out the figures more clearly through the stained glass windows. They were standing in a circle around something, a large, dark shape on the floor. It wasn't a coffin. It was moving. My foot caught on a rock, and I stumbled, cursing under my breath. The sound wasn't loud, but it was enough. The chanting stopped. The silence was immediate and deafening. My breath caught in my throat as I watched the figures inside the church turn in unison, their heads snapping toward the window like marionettes on strings. I froze, their blank faces staring out into the darkness, their eyes empty pits of black. Then, the door creaked open. I didn't wait to see who or what was coming out. I bolted back to the car, my shoes slipping on the wet grass, and threw myself inside. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the car into reverse, speeding back down the hill toward the main road. In the rearview mirror, I saw them spilling out of the church, their movements jerky and unnatural, their mouths open in soundless screams. They didn't chase me. They just stood there, watching as I drove away, their forms disappearing into the rain. When I finally reached the highway, the storm had eased, and the sky was beginning to lighten. I drove straight through until morning, not stopping until I hit a crowded rest stop miles away. I asked a few people there if they'd ever heard of Keldridge. No one had. Weeks later, I tried to find it again, retracing my route through the back roads. But the turnoff was gone, and there was no sign of the town. I don't know what I stumbled into that night, but sometimes, when I'm driving alone on a dark road, I catch myself glancing into the distance, half expecting to see the church spire rising against the horizon. I hope I never do. And she was still smiling. I was never one for dreams. I'd fall asleep, wake up, and that was it. No wild adventures or cryptic symbols to analyze. Just nothing. That's why I noticed when they started. The dreams weren't nightmares, exactly. They were just wrong. The first one was simple. I was walking down my street, the familiar rows of brick houses and the corner store with the perpetually flickering, open sign. But something was off. The houses were too perfect, their bricks too red, the windows too symmetrical. The streetlights hummed louder than they should, and the air tasted faintly metallic. When I looked down, my feet were bare, and the asphalt was warm, almost pulsing. I woke up in a cold sweat, but the weirdness didn't stop there. My phone alarm hadn't gone off, even though it was set. The time reads 7:06 a.m., 6 minutes late. The coffee pot, which I always set the night before, was empty, as if I'd forgotten, though I never did. Just little things, small deviations from my routine. The second night, the dream was more vivid. I was in my apartment, but it wasn't quite my apartment. The walls were the wrong color, too white, almost glowing, and there was a low hum coming from everywhere and nowhere. I walked to the fridge, and when I opened it, it wasn't food inside. Just rows and rows of glass jars, each filled with swirling black mist. I reached for one, and the hum grew louder, almost unbearable. As I touched the glass, I felt something sharp, like teeth, scrape against my palm from the inside. I woke up gasping, my hand throbbing. When I turned on the light, there was a faint red line across my palm, like a scratch that wasn't quite there. By the third night, I wasn't sure I wanted to fall asleep, but exhaustion won. This time, the dream wasn't in my apartment. I was somewhere vast, an endless expanse of dark water reflecting a pale gray sky. The horizon stretched out infinitely, no sun, no stars, just a faint, sourceless glow. In the distance, there was a figure, barely visible, standing on the water. It wasn't walking or moving. It was just there, staring at me, though I couldn't see its face. I tried to walk toward it, but the water pulled at my legs, heavy and resistant. When I called out, my voice didn't make a sound. I didn't hear it, and neither did the figure. It just raised a hand and pointed behind me. I turned around, and that's when I saw them. Hundreds of other figures, identical, their features blurred like smudged charcoal drawings, all standing silently in the water, all pointing at me. I jolted awake, the sheets tangled around me, the taste of salt in my mouth. My apartment was silent, but something felt off. The air was heavy, and the low hum from the dream seemed to echo faintly, just at the edge of hearing. The next day, things started disappearing. Small things at first. My keys weren't on the hook by the door where I always left them. My toothbrush wasn't in the holder. Then larger things. My phone, gone. The book I'd been reading, vanished. Even the art on the walls seemed to blur. The colors less distinct, the lines fuzzed. When I went outside, the world felt muted. The sounds of the city, cars honking, people talking, dogs barking, were distant, muffled. The air was colder, the sunlight dimmer, and the people, they were wrong. They moved too smoothly, too purposefully, as if they were being directed by invisible strings. No one made eye contact. No one spoke. The dreams got worse. In one, I was walking through an endless hallway, its walls covered in mirrors. My reflection was in every one, but it wasn't me. It was close, but the face looking back was just wrong. The eyes were too wide, the smile too sharp, the movements just a fraction of a second out of sync. As I walked, the reflections began to turn, one by one, watching me even as I kept moving forward. When I reached the end of the hallway, there was a door. It was red, with a black, polished handle. I hesitated, every nerve in my body screaming not to touch it, but the door swung open on its own, revealing a room filled with jars like the ones in my fridge dream. In the center stood the figure from the water, closer now. I could see its face, or lack of one. It was smooth and featureless, except for a single, glowing eye in the middle of its forehead. The hum from the jars grew louder, rattling the shelves, and the figure tilted its head at me. "Wake up," it said in a voice that sounded like it was coming from inside my skull. I woke up again, but this time, I wasn't in my bed. I was on the floor of my living room, the furniture pushed to the edges of the room as though someone, or something, had made space. On the coffee table was a single glass jar, empty. The hum was louder now, vibrating in my chest. I don't sleep anymore. I can't. The hum is constant now, even during the day, and I see the figures everywhere. In reflections, in the corners of my vision, in crowds that don't move right. They don't do anything. They just watch. Sometimes, I see the red door in random places. On the back of a building I've passed 100 times. At the end of an alley that shouldn't exist. Once, it appeared in my bathroom mirror. I smashed the glass, but the reflection didn't break. I know it's only a matter of time before the door opens again, before the figure steps through. And when it does, I don't think I'll wake up this time. I'm not a deep sleeper, so the moment the buzzing broke the silence of my bedroom, I was wide awake. The caller ID said, "No caller ID," and for a split second, I considered letting it ring. But I couldn't. There was something about that time. 3:14 a.m. felt significant, though I couldn't explain why. I answered, my voice groggy. "Hello?" There was no response, just a faint crackling sound, like static. I pulled the phone away, checked the screen to make sure the call was still connected, then put it back to my ear. "Hello?" I repeated. This time, I heard it. A faint voice, distant, like it was coming from the other end of a tunnel. "Do you remember?" My stomach tightened. "Who is this?" No answer, just that same static. And then, just as I was about to hang up, the voice came through again, clearer now, but still too distorted to recognize. "Do you remember the girl?" The call cut off before I could say anything else. I sat there in the dark, staring at my phone. My room felt colder than it had a moment before. I wanted to dismiss it as a prank call, some teenager screwing around. But the voice sounded wrong. It wasn't the voice itself, exactly, but something about the way the words hung in the air, as if they carried weight, like they were being spoken directly into my head rather than through the phone. I didn't go back to sleep. The next morning, I chalked it up to a weird one-off and tried to get on with my day. But the voice stuck with me. "Do you remember the girl?" The question played on a loop in my mind, though I couldn't think of what it could mean. Then I started noticing other things. Little things, at first. My coffee mug wasn't where I'd left it on the counter. The blinds in my living room were open when I was sure I'd closed them the night before. My phone alarm went off an hour early, even though I hadn't changed the settings. It wasn't until I was heading out to work on the third day that I found the picture. It was lying on the floor just inside my front door, a small, square Polaroid with faded edges. The image showed a girl standing in what looked like a forest. She was maybe 10 or 11, wearing a white dress, her hair long and dark. Her face wasn't entirely clear. It was slightly blurred, as if she'd moved just as the photo was taken, but her eyes were unmistakable. They were wide and hollow, and even though the photo was old, I could swear she was staring right at me. I didn't recognize her, but as I stared at the picture, I felt something stir deep in my chest, a sense of unease that felt uncomfortably close to guilt. I flipped the photo over. There was something written on the back in a messy scrawl that looked like it had been made with a dull pencil. 2 words, "Remember her." I dropped the photo like it had burned me. By now, I was seriously freaked out. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That someone left a creepy photo at my door and I got a weird phone call? They'd laugh me out of the station. So instead, I shoved the photo into a drawer and tried to forget about it. That night, I woke up again at 3:14 a.m. Not because of a call, but because of the sound of my front door creaking open. I shot out of bed, heart racing, and grabbed the baseball bat I kept under my bed. As quietly as I could, I crept into the hallway. The air felt thick, like walking through syrup, and the house was completely silent except for the faint sound of the wind outside. When I reached the front door, it was closed. Locked. I checked it 3 times to be sure, then stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The next morning, I found another Polaroid on my kitchen counter. This one showed the girl again, standing in the same forest, but now she was closer. Her face was still blurred, but her posture was different. Her shoulders were hunched, her arms hanging limp at her sides. On the back of the photo were the same 2 words, "Remember her." I couldn't take it anymore. I called my sister, Beth, who had always been better at keeping her head in a crisis than I was. I told her about the photos, the phone call, everything. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Did you forget?" she asked finally, her voice low. "Forget what?" I snapped, more out of fear than anger. "The cabin," she said. "The summer we went to the cabin with Mom and Dad. Don't you remember?" I didn't. Not at first. But as Beth started talking, fragments of memory began to surface. The old, musty cabin at the edge of a forest. long afternoons spent exploring the woods. And the girl, I hadn't thought about her in years. She'd been a neighbor, I think, someone who lived down the road from the cabin. Her name was Emily, and she'd followed us everywhere that summer, her bare feet crunching through the leaves as she trailed after me and Beth. I hadn't liked her. She was clingy, always asking questions, always watching. One day, I told her to leave us alone. I don't remember what I said exactly, but I remember the way her face crumpled and the way she ran off into the woods. She never came back. My parents had searched for her, of course, and so had the police, but they never found her. Eventually, they said she must have gotten lost, or maybe fallen into one of the deep ravines that cut through the forest. But now, as I sat there listening to Beth, I felt a sickening certainty that it hadn't been an accident. I hung up the phone without saying goodbye and went back to the drawer where I'd shoved the Polaroids. There were 3 now. I hadn't noticed the third one before. It showed the girl again, standing so close to the camera that her face took up the entire frame. This time, it wasn't blurred. And this time, her eyes were mine. The phone rang again. 3:14 a.m. I don't remember renting the house. I don't remember the address, the agreement, or even how I ended up with the keys in my hand. All I know is that I stood outside it one cloudy afternoon, staring up at its peeling white paint and warped shutters, and I knew it was mine. Or at least, it was where I was supposed to be. The house had a strange symmetry to it. Every window seemed to mirror another, every angle perfectly aligned. The longer I looked, the more unsettling it became, as though the house had been built by someone who understood the math of the world too well. But when I unlocked the door and stepped inside, it felt normal enough. The living room smelled faintly of dust and lavender, and the furniture was sparse. An old armchair, a coffee table, and a grandfather clock that ticked faintly in the corner. The kitchen was clean but outdated, its appliances humming softly. Upstairs were 3 bedrooms, all empty except for a single bed in the smallest room. The house seemed to be waiting for me to make it a home. That first night was quiet. I unpacked the little I'd brought with me, ate a microwave dinner, and went to bed. I fell asleep almost instantly, but when I woke up, I noticed something strange. The clock on my nightstand was gone. I was sure I'd set it there before going to sleep, but now there was only a faint ring of dust where it had been. I searched the room, then the rest of the house, but it was nowhere to be found. I chalked it up to exhaustion or carelessness. Maybe I'd left it in the box. Maybe I'd never even unpacked it. The second night, I fell asleep to the sound of rain tapping against the windows. When I woke up, the bed was in a different corner of the room. I sat up slowly, my heart pounding. The wall seemed closer somehow, the angle slightly off. I thought about leaving right then, but the moment I stepped into the hallway, the idea seemed ridiculous. Of course I'd moved the bed and forgotten. That was the logical explanation. I forced myself to laugh, to shake off the unease. The third day, the house began to change. The light switch in the living room, which I was sure had been to the right of the doorway, was now on the left. The kitchen cupboards opened the opposite way. When I went to open the front door, the knob was on the wrong side. That night, I dreamed of corridors. Endless hallways, dimly lit, with doors that didn't lead anywhere. The walls seemed to pulse like a heartbeat, and when I tried to run, the floor stretched beneath me, keeping me in place. I woke up gasping, the sheets tangled around my legs. The room was darker than it should have been, and when I fumbled for the lamp, it wasn't there. My fingers brushed against cold metal instead, and I realized the nightstand was gone too. The house wasn't waiting for me to make it a home. It was remaking itself around me. The next day, I tried to leave. I packed my bag and headed for the door, but when I opened it, the world outside was wrong. The sky was too low, the horizon blurred. The air felt heavy, like walking through water. I stepped back inside and slammed the door. The house creaked in approval. That night, I barricaded myself in the smallest bedroom. I didn't sleep. I sat on the bed, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. Around midnight, I heard a noise from downstairs. A faint rustling, like fabric brushing against wood. I crept out into the hallway, heart pounding, and peered down the stairs. The armchair in the living room was facing the wrong way. I was sure it had been facing the fireplace when I'd gone to bed, but now it was turned toward the staircase, as though watching me. A shadow passed through the room, flickering just at the edge of my vision. I tried to run back to the bedroom, but the hallway stretched impossibly long. The walls warped and groaned as I sprinted, and the door seemed to shrink, pulling away from me no matter how fast I moved. When I finally reached it, I slammed it shut and leaned against it, gasping for breath. But the room was no longer the same. The bed was gone, replaced by the armchair. The wallpaper had peeled away, revealing dark, pulsating wood underneath. The grandfather clock from the living room stood in the corner, ticking loudly. Too loudly. Each tick sounded like a heartbeat. The door behind me vanished. I turned, my hands clawing at the wall, but there was only smooth, unbroken wood. The room had no windows, no furniture, no light except for the faint glow of the clock's hands. And then the ticking stopped. I froze, the silence pressing against my ears. The glow of the clock's hands began to fade, and for a moment, I thought I was alone. But then, from the corner of the room, a voice whispered, "You're part of it now." The walls closed in, the clock melted into shadow, and I felt the house shift around me, folding me into its endless corridors. I don't know how long I've been here. Days? Weeks? The house doesn't let me leave. It doesn't let me sleep. Sometimes I hear footsteps, soft and deliberate, walking just beyond the next corner. Sometimes I see doors that lead to other rooms, but the rooms are empty except for faint whispers. And sometimes, when I pass a mirror, I see myself sitting in the armchair, staring back. The first time it happened, I thought I was losing my mind. I was walking home from a late-night shift, cutting through the usual shortcut, a narrow alley between two old brick buildings. I'd taken that path 100 times before, but that night was different. The air felt heavier, almost electric, like the moment before a thunderstorm. Halfway through, I tripped, not over a loose brick or a piece of trash, but over nothing. My foot caught on empty air, and I tumbled forward, landing hard on the pavement. Cursing under my breath, I scrambled to my feet and brushed myself off. That's when I noticed it. The alley wasn't the same. The bricks on the walls were darker, damp, and covered in graffiti that hadn't been there before. The street lamp at the far end was flickering, casting long, jittery shadows. I turned around, expecting to see the entrance to the alley, but it wasn't there. Instead, the alley stretched on endlessly in both directions, fading into darkness. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing strangely. No response. I checked my phone, but the screen was blank. No signal, no apps, just a faint glow. Panic bubbled up in my chest. I started walking, trying to find my way out, but the more I walked, the more the alley seemed to twist and shift around me. The graffiti on the walls wasn't random anymore. It was forming shapes, patterns, words. "Where do you think you're going?" My heart raced. I started to run, the walls blurring past me, the flickering light at the end of the alley growing brighter and brighter. When I finally reached it, I burst out into the open and stopped dead in my tracks. It wasn't my neighborhood. The buildings were taller, their windows dark and shattered. The streets were empty, littered with debris and overgrown with weeds. A pale, sickly light hung in the sky, but there was no sun or moon, just a vast, gray expanse that pressed down like a suffocating weight. I turned around, but the alley was gone. In its place was a massive wall, smooth and featureless, stretching as far as I could see. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice breaking the eerie silence. "Is anyone here?" For a moment, there was nothing. Then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic clicking sound, like claws tapping against concrete. It was coming from somewhere behind me. Slowly, I turned around. In the distance, something was moving. It was hard to make out at first, just a dark shape against the gray backdrop, but as it got closer, I realized it wasn't walking. It was crawling. Its limbs were too long, its joints bending in ways that made my stomach churn. It moved with an unnatural grace, its head cocked to one side, as though it was studying me. I didn't wait to see what it would do. I ran. The city was a maze of crumbling buildings and dead-end streets. Every time I thought I'd lost it, I'd hear the clicking again, closer than before. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't dare stop. Eventually, I stumbled into an open courtyard. In the center was a fountain, dry and cracked, with a statue of a figure holding something in its hands. I approached cautiously, my eyes darting around for any sign of the thing chasing me. The statue was strange, its features blurred and indistinct, as though it had been melted. In its hands was a cube, smooth and black, with faintly glowing lines etched into its surface. Without thinking, I reached out and touched it. The world shifted. I was back in the alley, lying on the ground where I'd tripped. The air was normal again, the bricks dry and familiar. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a notification pulling me back to reality. Everything was exactly as it had been before, except for one thing. In my hand was the cube. I took it home, not knowing what else to do. I set it on my kitchen table and stared at it, half expecting it to vanish or melt away. But it didn't. It just sat there, humming faintly, the lines on its surface pulsing with a soft, rhythmic glow. That night, I dreamt of the city, the crawling thing, the clicking sound. But in the dream, I wasn't running anymore. I was holding the cube, and the thing was afraid. The next morning, I tried to tell myself it had all been a hallucination. Stress, sleep deprivation, something. But the cube was still there, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me. Over the next few days, things started to change. I'd catch glimpses of the city in reflections, windows, mirrors, even puddles on the street. The air around me would feel heavy, charged, like it did that night in the alley. And the cube was growing brighter. One night, as I was lying in bed, I heard it, the clicking sound, faint at first, but unmistakable. My blood ran cold. Slowly, I turned my head toward the cube. It was glowing more intensely than ever, the lines on its surface shifting and rearranging themselves. "Come back," a voice whispered. It wasn't coming from the cube. It was coming from inside my head. I don't know what the cube is, or what that city was, but I think I brought something back with me. Or maybe I never really left. The clicking is louder now. I was flipping through an old scrapbook, one my mother had put together when I was a kid. It was the kind of rainy Saturday where nostalgia feels like the only option. So I curled up on the couch, letting the smell of worn paper and faded glue pull me back into childhood. Most of the pictures were familiar. Birthday parties, school plays, awkward family vacations. But about halfway through the book, I found a photo I'd never seen before. It was a group shot, taken in front of a cabin in the woods. There were 6 people in it, all smiling. My mother and father were in the center, arms wrapped around each other, looking younger than I'd ever seen them. To their left was a man I didn't recognize, his hand resting on my dad's shoulder. To the right was a woman I vaguely remembered as an old neighbor from years ago, her face lined with laughter. And in the very corner, almost hidden in the shadows, was me. Except it wasn't me. Not really. The kid in the photo had my face, my haircut, even the same gap-toothed grin I'd had when I was 6. But there was something off about him. His smile was too wide. His posture too stiff, like he was posing for a camera he didn't want to be in front of. And his eyes. His eyes were locked on the camera, unblinking, like he knew something the rest of us didn't. I flipped the photo over. The back was blank except for a single date, written in my mother's neat handwriting, July 14th, 1998. I frowned. That didn't make sense. My parents had told me countless stories about 1998, the year we moved into our house, the year they bought their first car, but they'd never mentioned a trip to the woods, and I didn't recognize the cabin or the people around us, not even the man standing so casually with my dad, as though they were old friends. I set the scrapbook aside, staring at the photo. The longer I looked, the more wrong it felt. My parents looked happy, genuinely happy, but there was a tension in the air, like the kind of energy you feel in the moments before a storm. And the kid, me, looked so unnatural, so aware. I decided to call my mom. She picked up on the 3rd ring, her voice warm but distracted. "Hey honey, what's up? Do you remember a trip to the woods in '98? I asked, skipping the small talk. There was a pause. "The woods? What are you talking about?" "I found a photo in your old scrapbook. It's you, Dad, and a few other people in front of a cabin. It says July 14th, 1998 on the back. Another pause, longer this time. When she finally spoke, her voice was tight. I don't know what you're talking about. Mom, it's right here. You're holding Dad's arm, and I stopped, hesitating. I'm in it too. At least, I think it's me. Listen, she said, her tone sharper now. I don't remember any trip, and I definitely don't remember that photo. Maybe you're mistaken. Before I could press her further, she hung up. I stared at my phone, my chest tightening. My mom was usually unflappable, the kind of person who could laugh off anything. I'd never heard her sound so unnerved. I turned my attention back to the photo. Something about it tugged at me, a nagging sense of déjà vu I couldn't shake. On a whim, I decided to scan the photo into my computer. Maybe I could zoom in, find some detail I'd missed. But when I loaded it onto my screen, the photo was different. The cabin was the same, as were my parents and the other adults. But the kid me was gone. In his place was empty space, a void where the shadows seemed darker, deeper than they should have been. I leaned in, squinting at the screen. There was something faint in the void, something that looked almost like movement, and then the screen flickered. For a brief moment, the photo changed again. The cabin disappeared, replaced by a dense forest shrouded in fog. The adults were standing in the same positions, but their expressions had shifted. My mom's smile was gone, replaced by a wide-eyed look of fear. My dad's hand was clenched around something, a knife, his knuckles white with tension, and the man I didn't recognize was staring straight at me. His face twisted into a grin that made my stomach turn. The screen flickered again, and the original photo reappeared. I sat back, my pulse racing. I told myself it was a glitch, a random artifact from the scanning process. But I didn't believe it. That night, I dreamed of the cabin. In the dream, I was standing outside it, the woods stretching endlessly in every direction. The air was thick with mist, and the only sound was the faint rustling of leaves. I tried to move, but my feet wouldn't budge. Something was behind me. I could feel it, a presence heavy and cold. When I turned, the kid from the photo was there. Me, but not me. He smiled, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. You shouldn't have found it, he said, his voice low and raspy. It wasn't meant for you. I woke up gasping, my sheets damp with sweat. The photo was on my nightstand, even though I was sure I'd left it in the living room. I picked it up, my hands trembling, and noticed something I hadn't seen before. There was a second date written faintly in the corner, almost invisible. July 14th, 2024. Today's date. As I stared at it, there was a knock at the door. 3 slow, deliberate raps that echoed through the silent apartment. My blood ran cold. I crept toward the door, peeking through the peephole. No one was there, but the scent of pine and earth wafted in through the crack beneath the door, rich and damp, like the air in the woods after a storm. And faintly, just beyond the threshold, I could hear a voice. It sounded like mine. Come outside, it whispered. We've been waiting. The first time I felt it, I was in the shower. Not the hot water streaming over me, but something else. A sensation like the air had changed, heavier and cold, pressing against my skin. I stopped mid-scrub, wiping the fog from the glass, but there was nothing there. Just the empty bathroom, pale tiles gleaming under the weak light. I turned the water off and stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle. That's when I heard it. A soft, faint sound, almost like breathing. It wasn't mine. My heart thudded in my chest, and I strained to listen, but the sound was gone as quickly as it had come. I laughed nervously at myself, chalked it up to the pipes, and went to bed. That night, I woke up to the smell of smoke. It wasn't strong, just a faint, acrid hint in the air that reminded me of something burning far away. My first thought was the wiring. I'd just moved into this house, an old fixer-upper on the edge of town, and I wouldn't have been surprised if something was faulty. I checked every room, sniffing at outlets and flipping light switches, but everything seemed fine. The smell lingered, though, following me back to my bedroom like a shadow. The next morning, I noticed something strange. A scorch mark, faint but undeniable, had appeared on the wooden floor in the hallway outside my room. It wasn't big, just a small, jagged circle about the size of a dinner plate, but it hadn't been there the day before. I crouched down to inspect it, running my fingers over the charred edges. The wood was brittle, crumbling under my touch. Termites, I muttered to myself, though I didn't believe it. Termites didn't burn things. The days that followed were strange. Things started disappearing. First, it was small stuff. Keys, socks, a pin I swore I just set down. But then it was larger things. My favorite jacket vanished from the coat rack. A chair from the dining table was just gone one morning, like it had never existed. Every time something disappeared, the smell of smoke would return, faint and acrid, seeping into the walls. One night, I came home from work to find the entire living room rearranged. The couch had been pushed into the middle of the room, the coffee table flipped on its side. The painting that had hung above the fireplace was now lying face down on the floor, the glass in the frame cracked. My first thought was that someone had broken in, but there was no sign of forced entry. The doors were locked. The windows were intact. I called the cops, but they couldn't find anything. The officer who came out suggested it might have been an animal. Raccoons can get into weird places, he said. Like that explained anything. I nodded, pretended to agree, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't an animal, that it was something else. The scorch marks kept spreading. Small ones at first, little circles and smudges on the floorboards, the walls, even the ceiling. But they started growing larger, more intricate, until they looked like symbols. Circles within circles, jagged lines that seemed to hum with their own quiet energy. I tried scrubbing them, sanding them, even painting over them, but they always came back. Stronger, darker. The breathing returned, too. I started hearing it late at night, just as I was drifting off to sleep. It was faint at first, like someone exhaling softly in the corner of the room. But each night, it grew louder, closer, until I could feel the warmth of it against my skin. Once, I woke up to find my hair damp, as though someone had been standing over me, breathing on the back of my neck. I set up cameras around the house, desperate for answers. For the first few nights, they captured nothing but static. But on the fourth night, I saw it. The footage started normally. Me going to bed, the room bathed in the pale glow of my bedside lamp. Then, at 3:17 a.m., the screen flickered and a shadow appeared. It wasn't shaped like a person, not exactly. It was taller, thinner, its edges rippling like smoke. It moved slowly, almost languidly, across the room, stopping at the foot of my bed. Then it bent down, impossibly long arms reaching toward me. The screen went black. I didn't sleep after that. The final straw came 2 nights ago. I woke up to find my entire bedroom engulfed in smoke, thick and choking, though there was no fire. I stumbled out of bed, coughing, and saw them. Figures standing in the hallway, their forms barely visible through the haze. They didn't move. They just stood there, watching me. One of them reached out, a hand, or something like a hand, extending toward me. It was made of ash, crumbling as it moved, but its grip was strong when it caught my wrist. Pain seared through me, and I screamed, pulling away with all my strength. When I looked down, a black mark had been burned into my skin, the same jagged circle that had appeared all over the house. I fled that night, driving until the sun rose. I don't know where I'm going, or if I can outrun this thing. The mark on my wrist hasn't faded. It's growing darker, spreading up my arm like veins of smoke. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the car, I hear the breathing again, and the smell of smoke. God, it's everywhere now, clinging to me like a second skin. I don't think it's the house that was haunted. I think it's me, and whatever it is, it's not done with me yet. When I got home that evening, my phone buzzed with a missed call from a number I didn't recognize. It wasn't unusual. Wrong numbers happened all the time. But when I played the message, I froze. "Hi, it's me," said the voice on the recording. "I don't have much time, but I need you to listen carefully. Don't go home tonight. They're waiting for you." The voice sounded exactly like mine. I played it again, holding the phone tighter, trying to make sense of it. The cadence, the tone, it was uncanny. It wasn't just similar. It was my voice, only strained, like I was speaking through gritted teeth. I should have called someone, reported it, done something sensible, but I didn't. Instead, I laughed nervously and shook my head, chalking it up to a prank. Technology could mimic voices now, right? Someone had just gotten hold of mine and was messing with me. I deleted the message, grabbed a frozen dinner from the fridge, and settled onto the couch, trying to forget about it. But I couldn't. That night, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing. Groggy, I fumbled for it on the nightstand and squinted at the screen. Another call from the same number. My stomach twisted as I answered. Hello? I croaked. Silence. Then, after a moment, that same voice. My voice whispered, "Why didn't you listen?" The line went dead. I didn't sleep after that. I sat up in bed, clutching my phone, every shadow in my apartment suddenly feeling sharper, more threatening. I checked the locks on the doors and windows 3 times, then a 4th, my hands shaking the entire time. The next morning, I called my service provider to report the number, but they told me it didn't exist. "It's probably a spoof," the technician said. "Happens more than you think." He sounded bored, like he'd had the conversation 100 times before. That didn't explain the voice. The calls stopped for a while after that, and I convinced myself it really was just a prank. Until the day I found the note. It was waiting for me on the kitchen counter, written in my own handwriting. "You need to leave." I didn't remember writing it. I didn't even own the notebook it had been torn from. The paper was old and yellowed, the edges frayed as if it had been ripped hastily. I stared at the note for what felt like an hour, my mind racing. Was I losing it? Sleepwalking? Could I have written it in some kind of fugue state? That night, I noticed things were out of place. My coffee mug wasn't where I'd left it. The closet door was open, though I always closed it before bed. The faucet in the bathroom dripped, even though I double-checked it was off. Small things, easy to dismiss on their own. But together they painted a picture I didn't want to acknowledge. Someone, or something, was in my apartment. The calls started again a week later. This time, they didn't come at night. They came while I was at work, while I was at the grocery store, even while I was driving. Each voicemail was more frantic than the last. "It's not safe. They're coming. You have to go now." I didn't delete them this time. I started saving them, replaying them obsessively, trying to find any clue that could explain what was happening. But every time I listened, all I heard was my own voice, growing more desperate. The turning point came when I looked in the mirror. I'd been washing my face, trying to shake the exhaustion that clung to me like a second skin. When I glanced up, I saw myself staring back, just like always. But this time, the reflection moved a half-second too late. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I leaned in closer, my hands gripping the edge of the sink. My reflection did the same, but its movements were slightly off, too smooth, too deliberate. And then it smiled. It wasn't my smile. It was too wide, the corners of its mouth stretching unnaturally, revealing teeth that were sharp and wrong. My knees buckled, and I stumbled back, hitting the bathroom door. By the time I looked up again, the reflection was normal, mirroring my own wide-eyed terror. That night, I packed a bag. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay. But as I zipped up the bag, the lights in my apartment flickered, and the air turned heavy, oppressive. A low hum filled the room, coming from nowhere and everywhere all at once. My phone buzzed on the counter. Another voicemail. This time, I didn't listen to it. I grabbed my keys and bolted out the door, not stopping until I was in my car with the doors locked and the engine running. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Someone was sitting in the back seat. It was me. Not the me I saw in the mirror every day, but the other me. The one from the voicemails, the notes, the wrong smile. Its eyes met mine through the mirror, and it tilted its head, almost playfully. "Too late," it said in my voice. The next thing I remember is waking up on the side of the road. My car empty, my bag gone. I don't know how I got there, or how long I'd been out. My phone was sitting on the passenger seat, a single voicemail waiting to be played. I haven't listened to it yet. I don't think I want to. But wherever I go, I see it. My reflection, my shadow, my double. Always just out of reach, always watching. And it's still smiling. It started with a postcard. I found it in my mailbox on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday morning. The front was a grainy photo of a place I didn't recognize. A narrow dirt road lined with tall, leafless trees that seemed to go on forever. There was no name, no description, just the picture. On the back, in shaky, uneven handwriting, were 3 words, "Wish you were." Not "wish you were here," just "wish you were." I turned it over a few times, confused. There was no return address, no postmark, and the handwriting wasn't familiar. I figured it was some kind of prank, maybe from an old friend trying to be funny. I shrugged it off, tucked it into the junk drawer, and forgot about it. Until the second postcard arrived. This one showed the same road, but closer. The angle had shifted slightly, like whoever was behind the camera had walked a little further down the path. The trees loomed larger, their twisted branches almost reaching across to touch each other. On the back, the message read, "Getting closer." Okay, now I was creeped out. I texted a few friends, asking if they were behind it. No one admitted to anything, and most just joked about how weird it was. I even Googled the image, but nothing came up. The postcard went into the drawer with the first one. By the time the third postcard arrived, I was starting to lose sleep. This time, the image showed the end of the road. A dilapidated wooden cabin sat at the edge of the frame, its windows dark and lifeless. The message on the back read, "Come see me." That was when I noticed the smudge. At first, I thought it was dirt, but as I held the postcard closer, I realized it was a fingerprint, and it wasn't mine. I took it to the police. The officer at the desk listened patiently as I explained, flipping the postcard over in his gloved hands. He told me they'd look into it, but didn't seem all that concerned. "Could just be a hoax," he said, his tone dismissive. I left feeling no safer than when I walked in. Days passed, and no more postcards came. I thought it was over. I was wrong. It was around midnight a week later when I first heard it. A soft, deliberate knock at my door. I live alone, so the sound instantly put me on edge. I tiptoed to the peephole, but the porch was empty. The knocking stopped after a few minutes, and I convinced myself it was just kids messing around. The next night, it happened again, and the next. Always at midnight. Always 3 slow, measured knocks. By the 4th night, I was too scared to even look. I just sat in the dark, clutching my phone, listening as the knocks came and went like clockwork. That's when the postcard arrived, the 4th and final one. It wasn't in the mailbox this time. It was slipped under my door, the edges damp from the night air. The image showed the same cabin, but this time, the door was open. A figure stood in the doorway, its silhouette blurry and indistinct. On the back, the message read, "I'm here." Panic set in. I called the police, begging them to send someone over. They promised to dispatch a car, but by the time the officer arrived, there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no evidence that someone had been on my porch. The officer didn't seem convinced, and I could tell he thought I was overreacting. I didn't sleep that night. I kept every light in the house on, every door locked, every window latched. But when dawn broke, I felt like I could finally breathe again. Maybe whoever it was had given up. Maybe it really was just a cruel joke. Then I noticed the dirt. It was a faint trail, just inside my front door. Footprints, bare feet, leading from the door to my bedroom, and then nothing. They stopped in the middle of the room, like whoever, or whatever, had been there had vanished into thin air. I packed a bag that morning and drove to my sister's place 3 towns over. I didn't tell her everything, just that I needed to get away for a while. She didn't ask questions, just let me crash on her couch. The postcards stopped after that. The knocking, too. But sometimes, late at night, I dream about that cabin at the end of the road. In the dream, I'm walking toward it, my feet crunching on the gravel, the air cold and heavy. The door is always open, and the figure is always waiting, its face hidden in shadow. And no matter how hard I try to stop, my legs keep moving, carrying me closer and closer until I wake up drenched in sweat. A few weeks ago, I got a text from an unknown number. It was just a photo. The cabin, taken from the same angle as the first postcard. Beneath it, a message, still waiting. I deleted it immediately, but sometimes I wonder what would happen if I went. The first sign something was wrong came at 3:14 a.m. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, dragging me out of a dream I couldn't quite remember. Squinting at the screen, I saw the notification. Unknown contact, are you awake? Normally, I'd have ignored it, but something about the message, its simplicity, its timing, sent a small shiver down my spine. Against my better judgment, I replied, "Who is this?" The response was immediate. "You don't remember me, but I remember you. Check your front door." My heartbeat quickened. Was this some kind of joke? A prank? I tossed the covers aside, pulling on a hoodie as I tiptoed through the silent apartment. The hallway outside was bathed in shadows, the only light spilling in from a flickering street lamp. I reached the door, pausing before unlocking it. The chain stayed on as I cracked it open. There, sitting on the welcome mat, was a package, plain, wrapped in brown paper, with no return address. By this point, every horror movie I'd ever seen was screaming at me to slam the door and call the police. Instead, I brought it inside. The package was lighter than I expected, and when I unwrapped it, all I found was a small, black box with no markings. A subtle hum emanated from it, almost imperceptible, like the sound of distant machinery. Inside the box was a single key. It wasn't an ordinary key. It was old, ornate, made of tarnished silver with an intricate design on the handle. At its center was a small gemstone that seemed to glow faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. Before I could think too much about what it meant, my phone buzzed again. "Take the key. There's a door waiting for you." "What door?" I typed back, my hands shaking slightly. "The one you've always ignored." The words hit me harder than they should have. There was a door, one I passed every day on my way to work. It was set into the side of an old building, its frame warped with age, the paint chipped and peeling. No sign, no handle, no reason to notice it. And yet, I had. Without really understanding why, I pocketed the key, grabbed my jacket, and headed out. The city was eerie at night, its usual hum replaced by an unsettling quiet. I walked quickly, the key feeling heavier with each step, like it wanted to pull me somewhere. When I reached the door, it was as nondescript as ever, blending into its surroundings like it belonged to a forgotten past. But tonight, something was different. A faint glow seeped from its edges, the same pulse as the gemstone in the key. I hesitated, every logical part of my brain screaming at me to turn around. But then I remembered the message, the one you've always ignored. Sliding the key into the lock, I turned it. The door swung open without a sound. On the other side was not a room, but a corridor that stretched impossibly far, lined with mirrors on both sides. Each mirror reflected a version of me, but they weren't identical. In one, I was older, wearing a military uniform I'd never owned. In another, I had scars running down my face, my eyes cold and distant. The corridor called to me, its air charged with the scent of ozone. I stepped through. The door shut behind me. I don't know how long I walked. Time felt slippery, like it didn't exist here. The reflections in the mirrors began to shift, showing scenes from my life. Moments I'd forgotten or buried. The day my childhood dog ran away. The fight with my sister that ended in years of silence. The time I let someone else take the blame for something I'd done. Each memory hit like a physical blow, but I couldn't stop moving. At the end of the corridor was another door, this one made of glass. Beyond it, I could see a room bathed in soft light, its walls lined with bookshelves. When I entered, the room greeted me like an old friend. It was cozy, impossibly so, with a roaring fireplace and the scent of something familiar. Freshly baked cookies? Or was it my grandmother's perfume? In the center of the room sat a figure, their face obscured by shadows. They motioned for me to sit across from them, and I obeyed, too weary to question. The figure leaned forward, and though I couldn't see their features, I felt the weight of their gaze. "Do you know why you're here?" I shook my head. They gestured to the bookshelves. "These are your choices. Every decision you've made, every path you didn't take, recorded here. Tonight, you get to rewrite one." The thought was intoxicating. A second chance. A do-over. I stood, running my fingers along the spines of the books. Each title was a decision. The day I said no to Sarah, The job I didn't take. The apology I never made. One in particular caught my eye. The door I didn't open. Without thinking, I pulled it from the shelf. The figure tilted their head. Interesting choice. Are you certain? I hesitated, then nodded. The book dissolved in my hands, its pages scattering like ash. The room began to shift, the warmth replaced by a cold wind that howled through the air. I found myself back at the original door, the key still in my hand. Only this time, the world around me was different. The streets were quieter, the buildings taller, the air electric with possibilities I couldn't name. I looked down at the key. Its gemstone pulsed faintly, and I realized I wasn't done yet. Somewhere out there, another door was waiting, and this time, I wouldn't ignore it. I noticed the first crack in the world while standing in line at the grocery store. It wasn't anything dramatic, a flicker, like the overhead fluorescent lights were about to give out. But it wasn't just the lights. For a split second, everything flickered. The cashier, the shelves, the guy in front of me with a cart full of energy drinks. It all turned into static, like a TV losing its signal, and then popped back to normal. Nobody else seemed to notice. The cashier kept scanning, the guy in front of me swiped his card, and the beep of the register continued uninterrupted. I chalked it up to being tired. Too much caffeine, not enough sleep. A glitch in my own brain, not the world. The second crack came a few days later. I was unlocking my front door when I heard a voice inside. My apartment was empty, or it should have been. The voice wasn't speaking to me, though. It was faint, like a conversation I was eavesdropping on by accident. "I told you, it's not ready," someone said. "You're running out of time," replied another voice, lower and rougher. I pressed my ear to the door, holding my breath. There was no sound of footsteps, no creak of movement, just the voices, too clear to be muffled by walls. "You need to fix it before they notice," the second voice said. "Shut up," snapped the first one, and then the voices were gone. I stayed frozen there for a long time before finally opening the door. The apartment was exactly as I'd left it. Too neat, too quiet. My skin crawled as I stepped inside, and I locked the door behind me like that would help. After that, it got worse. The cracks weren't flickers anymore. They were tears. I'd see a corner of a building ripple like fabric in the wind, revealing something underneath, something jagged and bright, like shattered glass reflecting infinite light. Once, while waiting for the bus, the sky turned black for half a second. Not like night, like the color had been drained entirely, leaving only emptiness. When I blinked, it was blue again, cloudless and serene. The worst part wasn't seeing the tears. It was knowing that no one else could. People kept walking, talking, scrolling their phones. They didn't see the cracks spreading across the edges of reality, but I did. And the more I noticed, the more frequent they became. I started testing it, just to see if I was losing my mind. One day, I reached out and touched a flicker, a ripple in the air above my desk at work. The moment my fingers brushed it, the world hiccuped. My coworkers froze mid-sentence. The clock on the wall stopped ticking. Even the hum of the AC died out. Then, everything rewound. People moved backward, laughing and talking in reverse, until they reached the exact moment I touched the ripple. Time snapped back into place, and I yanked my hand away like I'd been burned. My heart pounded as I stared at my desk. Nobody else seemed to notice anything. That night, the voices came back. This time, they weren't in my apartment. They were outside my window. "It's unstable," one of them said. It was the same voice as before, calm and impatient. "She's interfering. She shouldn't be able to see it," the other replied. "Tell that to her," the first said. I yanked the curtains open, but there was nothing there, just the empty street below. But when I turned back, I saw something new. A tiny, pulsing crack in the middle of my living room. It hovered in the air like a jagged tear in fabric, shimmering faintly. I stared at it for what felt like hours, but it didn't move, didn't grow. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, the crack was gone. Or at least, I thought it was, until I went outside. The cracks were everywhere. In the pavement, in the clouds, even in people. My neighbor's arm flickered like static as he waved to me. A tree on the corner bent at an impossible angle, folding in on itself like an optical illusion. I felt like I was standing inside a broken snow globe, watching the pieces shift and fracture. And then I saw him. He was standing across the street, tall and sharp-featured, wearing a suit that seemed too clean, too crisp. His face was smooth, symmetrical to the point of being unnerving, and his eyes glowed faintly, like screens. When I looked at him, the cracks seemed to pulse, growing brighter, wider. "Who are you?" I shouted, stepping closer. He didn't answer. He just tilted his head, watching me like I was some kind of lab rat. Then, in a voice that felt like it came from inside my head, he said, "You're not supposed to notice." "Notice what?" I demanded, but he didn't respond. He raised a hand, and the world paused. Everything froze. The cars, the people, even the wind. The cracks stopped shimmering, suspended mid-flicker. I was the only thing still moving. "What's happening?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The man's face didn't change, but his eyes seemed to grow brighter. "You're not ready," he said, and then he snapped his fingers. The world rewound. I woke up in my bed, gasping for air, my heart pounding. For a moment, I thought it was a dream, but then I saw it. The crack, faint and shimmering, was still there, hovering in the corner of my room. Now, the cracks follow me everywhere. I see them in my reflection, in the eyes of strangers, in the spaces between words on a page. Sometimes I hear the voices again, faint whispers telling me to stop, to let go, to forget. But I can't, because whatever's behind those cracks, it's trying to get in. I was 9 years old, and my cousins and I were spending the summer at my grandparents' old farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. The kind of place that smelled like wood smoke and mothballs, with creaky floors and endless rooms that seemed to stretch on forever. It was perfect for hide and seek, especially after dark, when the shadows swallowed the corners and every creak of the floorboard felt like a secret. That night, I was it. I counted to 20 with my eyes squeezed shut, ignoring my cousins' giggles as they scrambled off into the dark. When I finished, I opened my eyes and started searching. The house was eerily quiet as I moved from room to room, checking under beds and behind curtains. My cousins were good at hiding, but I was determined to find them. Eventually, I made my way to the attic, a dusty, cramped space filled with old trunks and forgotten furniture. The air was stale, and the single bare bulb cast long, eerie shadows. "Gotcha!" I shouted, throwing open a trunk. But it was empty, just a pile of moth-eaten blankets. I checked behind an old rocking chair, then a wardrobe, but there was no one there. I was about to leave when I noticed something strange. In the far corner of the attic, partially hidden by a stack of boxes, was a door I'd never seen before. It didn't make sense. I'd been in the attic plenty of times, and I was certain that door hadn't been there before. It was small, barely taller than I was, with peeling white paint and a rusty knob. Something about it felt wrong, but I was 9, and curiosity was stronger than fear. I turned the knob, and the door creaked open. Inside was a narrow staircase, spiraling down into the dark. A cold draft wafted up, carrying with it the faint smell of damp earth. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. Maybe one of my cousins had found this secret door and decided it was the perfect hiding spot. There was no response. I hesitated, then stepped inside, the stairs groaning under my weight. The air grew colder with every step, and the smell of earth grew stronger. Eventually, I reached the bottom, where the stairs opened into a small, circular room. The walls were made of rough stone, and the only light came from a single candle flickering on a wooden table in the center. Sitting at the table was a man. He was hunched over, his back to me, scribbling something onto a piece of paper. He wore an old-fashioned suit, the kind you'd see in black and white photos, and his hair was dark and slicked back. Something about him made my skin crawl, but I couldn't look away. "Excuse me?" I said, my voice barely a whisper. The man froze. Slowly, he turned his head, and I'll never forget the way his eyes looked, wide and black, like deep wells that went on forever. His face was pale and gaunt, his lips stretched into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, his voice soft but sharp, like the edge of a knife. I I'm sorry, I stammered, backing toward the stairs. I didn't mean to. Do you want to play a game? He interrupted, his smile widening. I shook my head, my heart pounding in my chest. No, I was just looking for my cousins. They're not here, he said, standing up. He was taller than I'd expected, his shadow stretching unnaturally long across the room. But if you stay, we can play. I turned and bolted up the stairs, not daring to look back. The air seemed thicker as I climbed, my lungs burning with every breath. When I reached the attic, I slammed the door shut and pushed a heavy trunk in front of it, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip it. I ran downstairs to find my cousins in the living room, laughing and eating popcorn. Where were you? One of them asked. We've been looking for you. There's a man in the attic. I blurted out, tears streaming down my face. He wanted to play a game. My cousins exchanged confused looks. What are you talking about? We've been downstairs the whole time. I dragged them up to the attic, determined to prove I wasn't lying. But when we got there, the door was gone. The corner where it had been was now just a blank wall, covered in cobwebs and dust. No one believed me. They said I must have imagined it, that I'd let the shadows play tricks on me. But I knew what I saw. For years, I tried to forget about that night. I told myself it was just a childhood nightmare, a memory warped by time and fear. But last week, while cleaning out my late grandparents' house, I went up to the attic one last time. The door was back. It looked exactly the same as it had all those years ago. Small, peeling, with a rusty knob. I should have left it alone. I should have turned around and walked away. But something compelled me to open it, to see if the staircase was still there. It was. The air was cold and damp, just like before, and the stairs creaked under my weight as I descended. When I reached the bottom, the room was the same too. Stone walls, wooden table, flickering candle. But this time, the man wasn't there. Instead, there was a piece of paper lying on the table. On it was a single sentence, written in neat, looping handwriting. I knew you'd come back. The candle flickered out, plunging the room into darkness. And then I heard it, the soft, hollow laugh that had haunted my childhood. It began with the voicemail, a single, short message left on my phone while I was in the shower. Hello? Are you there? Please, pick up. The voice sounded like mine. Not a perfect match. It was slower, softer, with a slight tremor, but close enough that it made me pause. The timestamp said 3:17 p.m., which was impossible because I'd been home alone the whole time. My phone hadn't even rung. I replayed it twice, my heart thudding harder each time, before deleting it. I told myself it was some kind of scam or prank, but as I stood there staring at my phone, I felt the distinct sensation of being watched. Not from outside, not through a window or screen. It was deeper than that. It felt like the gaze came from within. That night, I dreamed I was floating in an endless black space. The air was thick and warm, buzzing faintly with a low hum, like the sound of power lines in the distance. I couldn't move my arms or legs, but I didn't feel paralyzed, more like I wasn't supposed to move. A light appeared in the distance, faint and flickering, like a candle barely holding on. As I drifted toward it, I realized it wasn't a flame at all but an eye. A massive, unblinking eye, its iris swirling with colors I couldn't name. It stared at me with an intensity that made my chest ache, like it was trying to bore into my soul. I woke up gasping, my sheets soaked with sweat. The clock read 3:17 a.m. The days after the dream felt strange. At first, it was little things. I'd pick up my keys only to find them in a different spot seconds later. My laptop background changed to a photo I didn't recognize, a black void with a faint, glowing eye in the center. I deleted it, thinking I'd been hacked, but the image returned every time I restarted the computer. My reflection started acting oddly, too. It wasn't dramatic, no sinister grins or sudden movements, just subtle things. A blink that lasted too long, a head tilt that didn't match mine, a faint, almost imperceptible delay, like my reflection was considering its options before mimicking me. One evening, I tried to test it. I raised my left hand, then my right, then waved them both in a pattern that seemed impossible to mess up. My reflection followed me perfectly, but as I lowered my hands, I thought I saw it smile. Not a full smile, just the barest twitch of the corner of its mouth. I froze, staring into its eyes, and for the first time, I realized what was so unnerving about them. They weren't mine. It came to a head 2 weeks later when I started losing time. I'd blink, and the clock would jump ahead by hours. Once, I came to in the middle of the grocery store, holding a basket full of items I didn't remember picking up, things I didn't even need. Cleaning supplies, batteries, a large spool of red thread. The worst part was that none of the other shoppers seemed to notice anything unusual about me. If anything, they avoided me, their gazes sliding past me like I wasn't there. I tried to tell myself it was stress, sleep deprivation, anything logical, but deep down, I knew better. Something was wrong with me. In me, the voicemails returned. Please listen. You're not safe. The voice sounded weaker this time, more desperate. There was a crackling noise in the background, like static or faint whispers, too distorted to make out. I wanted to delete it like before, but something stopped me. That night, I set up a camera in my bedroom. I wanted proof of what, I wasn't sure, but I needed to know. When I watched the footage the next morning, my stomach twisted into knots. For the first hour or so, nothing happened. I lay still, breathing softly in the faint glow of my bedside lamp. But then, around 3:17 a.m., my body sat up abruptly, like a puppet yanked upright by its strings. I didn't look at the camera. Instead, I turned toward the mirror on the far wall. My head tilted slightly, and then I spoke. "Are you ready to see?" My voice was low, barely above a whisper, but it sent a chill down my spine. I watched as my reflection leaned forward, closer to the mirror's surface, while my real body remained perfectly still. Then the screen went black. I must have turned off the camera, but I had no memory of doing so. My hands trembled as I deleted the footage, unsure whether I was more afraid of what I'd seen or what I hadn't. The next morning, the mirror was gone. Not shattered, not removed, just gone. The wall was smooth, as if it had never been there in the first place. And on my phone was a final voicemail. "I tried to warn you. Now it's your turn." I don't know who or what left the message, but I understand what it meant. The reflection. The thing that had been watching me, mimicking me, waiting. It wasn't just inside the mirror. It was inside me. And now, when I look in the mirrorless wall, I see something moving just beneath my skin. There's a park near my neighborhood, one of those places that feels older than the city around it. It's small, just a winding path, a few benches, and a tiny, stagnant pond choked with algae. Most people don't go there anymore. The city keeps it technically maintained, but barely. Overgrown grass, broken streetlights, and graffiti scrawled on the benches give it an air of neglect. It's quiet, though, and that's why I started going there. Life was feeling heavy. Work stress, a breakup, the usual midlife stuff, and I just needed a place to breathe. A place where no one would bother me. The first time I noticed the woman was on a Thursday evening. The park was empty except for her, sitting on the farthest bench near the pond. She was hunched over, her back to me, wearing a thin gray coat that looked too light for the crisp fall weather. Her hair was dark and wild, tumbling over her shoulders like she hadn't brushed it in weeks. I'm not the type to approach strangers, especially ones who give off an unsettling vibe, so I ignored her. Still, as I walked past, I couldn't shake the feeling she was aware of me. Not watching, but noticing, in some quiet, unnerving way. The second time was 3 days later. She was sitting on the same bench, in the same coat, her posture exactly the same. She didn't move as I passed, not even when a gust of wind rattled the bare branches around us. I walked a little faster that time. By the third time, I was actively trying to avoid her. I took a different route around the park, keeping my distance. But when I glanced toward the bench, she was already looking at me. No, through me. Her face was pale, gaunt, with deep shadows under her eyes. Her lips were slightly parted, like she was about to say something, but no sound came. I shivered and walked home, telling myself I'd just been imagining things. That night, I dreamed of the park. In the dream, it was darker than it should have been. The streetlights were out, and the only sound was the faint rustling of leaves. The woman was there, but she wasn't sitting anymore. She was standing in the middle of the path, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Her mouth moved, but the words were wrong, garbled, like a tape being played backward. When I woke, my chest was tight, and the sound of her voice lingered in my ears. I decided to avoid the park for a while, but it didn't matter. The next evening, I saw her again, not at the park, but outside my apartment building. She was standing across the street, half hidden in the shadows, staring up at my window. I froze, my hand on the doorknob, heart pounding. I wanted to believe it wasn't her, that it was just someone who looked like her. But deep down, I knew. She didn't move, didn't even flinch when a car passed between us. I watched her for what felt like hours, but when I finally blinked, she was gone. After that, I started noticing her everywhere. At the grocery store, standing at the end of an aisle, in the reflection of a bus window as it drove past. Once, in the middle of the night, I woke up and saw her standing on the sidewalk below my window, looking straight up at me. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was stress or sleep deprivation, but no matter where I went, she was there. Always watching, always silent. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I went back to the park, determined to confront her, to tell her to leave me alone. The air was cold, and the trees were skeletal against the dark sky. The pond was still and black, its surface reflecting nothing. She was there, of course, on her bench. This time, she was facing me. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, her lips twisted into something that might have been a smile. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice cracking. She didn't answer. Instead, she stood, her movements slow and deliberate. Then she pointed toward the pond. I didn't want to look. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but my legs moved on their own. The closer I got to the water, the stronger the smell became, earthy, rotten, suffocating. When I reached the edge, I saw it. There, just beneath the surface, was a body, pale and bloated, its features distorted but unmistakable. It was her. The same gray coat, the same wild hair. I stumbled back, my mind racing. How was this possible? I turned to look at the bench, but she was gone. The park was empty. I ran home, locked every door and window, and didn't sleep that night. The police didn't believe me when I called the next day. They said the park had been searched months ago after a missing person report, and no body had been found. They humored me, sending a single officer to check, but of course, nothing was there. I moved a week later, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever had happened in that park. But it didn't work. She's still there. Not always, but often enough that I know I'll never escape her. She watches me from the shadows, her head tilted just slightly, her lips still moving with those garbled, incomprehensible words. And sometimes, late at night, I catch a reflection of her in the window or a mirror. Only now, it's not just her. It's me too. I had a job once as a house sitter. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well, and I liked the solitude. The owners were a retired couple who spent half the year traveling. Their house was a sprawling Victorian-style mansion, the kind of place that looked like it should have been on the cover of a Gothic novel. It was perched on the edge of a forest, miles away from the nearest town, which only added to its creepy charm. When they called me, the couple warned me that the house was quirky. Their words, not mine. They didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. I figured they were just referring to the usual old house problems. Creaky floors, drafty windows, that sort of thing. But from the moment I stepped inside, I knew quirky wasn't the right word. The air inside the house was different. It wasn't musty or stale, like you'd expect from a place that size. Instead, it was heavy, like the weight of years pressed into the walls and floors. The first time I walked through the front door, I got the unsettling sensation that I wasn't walking into an empty house. It felt occupied. The couple left me a list of instructions. Most of it was typical stuff. Feed the cat, water the plants, don't leave the lights on in unused rooms. But one rule stood out. Written in bold letters at the bottom of the list were these words: "Do not open the door to the study after 9 p.m. under any circumstances." I laughed when I read it, thinking it was some kind of weird joke. But as I stood there, staring at the closed study door. I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't joking. The first night passed uneventfully. I made myself dinner, watched TV in the parlor, and fed their ancient, grumpy cat, Mr. Whiskers. By 9 p.m., I was upstairs in the guest bedroom, reading a book and trying not to think about the study. It was around 10:30 when I heard it, a soft creak, like a door opening. My heart jumped. I told myself it was nothing, just the house settling. But then came another sound, a faint shuffle, like footsteps. I froze, straining to hear. The noise stopped, and for a long moment, everything was silent. Then, just as I started to relax, I heard it again. This time, it was louder. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and crept into the hallway. The sound was coming from downstairs, near the study. The house was pitch black, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the stained glass windows. My hand trembled as I turned on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. When I reached the study door, I stopped. It was slightly ajar. I was sure I had seen it closed earlier. The air around it felt colder, almost frigid, and my breath came out in faint white puffs. I reached out to push the door closed, but before I could touch it, I heard something from inside. A voice. It was faint, almost a whisper, but it was there. It sounded like a woman, her words slurred and overlapping, like she was speaking underwater. I stumbled back, my heart hammering. Every instinct told me to run, to leave the house and never come back. But something kept me rooted in place, a horrible, morbid curiosity. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaking. The whispering stopped. For a moment, the silence was so complete it felt deafening. Then, slowly, the door creaked open wider. The beam of my flashlight landed on an old, leather-bound chair in the center of the room. It was facing away from me, toward a massive antique desk cluttered with papers and books. The chair began to swivel, turning ever so slowly. I held my breath, frozen with fear. And then, it stopped. Empty. I let out a shaky laugh, relief flooding over me. But the moment was short-lived. The whispering started again, louder this time, coming from all around me. The papers on the desk rustled as if caught in a breeze, though the air was deathly still. I backed away, ready to bolt, but as I turned, I saw it. A shadow, darker than the room itself, standing in the doorway. It wasn't human. Its form was all wrong. Too tall, with limbs that bent in ways that defied logic. Its head tilted toward me, and though it had no eyes, I felt its gaze. The whispering grew into a deafening roar, a cacophony of voices overlapping in a language I didn't understand. The shadow took a step toward me, its movements jerky and unnatural. I stumbled back, tripping over the edge of the rug and landing hard on the floor. That's when I saw the markings. They were etched into the floorboards beneath the rug, intricate, spiraling symbols that glowed faintly in the darkness. The air around them shimmered, and the cold grew even more intense. The shadow paused, as if noticing the symbols for the first time. It let out a sound, a low, guttural growl that vibrated through my chest, summoning every ounce of strength I had. I scrambled to my feet and ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air under the cold night sky. The house loomed behind me, its windows dark and silent, but I could feel it watching me, alive in a way no house should be. The couple never contacted me after that night. When I tried calling them to explain what had happened, their number had been disconnected. The house was sold a few months later, and I heard through the grapevine that the new owners didn't last long. Something about unexplained disturbances. I don't know what was in that study, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear it. The faint whisper of a voice just beyond the edge of hearing, calling me back to a house I'll never forget. It was tacked to the bulletin board at the coffee shop I go to every morning, sandwiched between ads for yoga classes and missing cats. The edges were frayed, the paper slightly yellowed, but the bold red letters caught my eye. Experience something new. Free escape room. Prize, $10,000. Below that was a single address and a phone number. No company name, no rules, nothing else. I don't know why I took it. Maybe it was boredom. Or maybe the promise of 10 grand was just too tempting. That evening, I called the number. A woman answered on the first ring, her voice smooth and professional. "You've made a wonderful choice," she said before I could even introduce myself. "We'll see you tomorrow at 8 p.m. sharp. Bring nothing but yourself." The line went dead before I could ask any questions. The address was a warehouse on the edge of town, far from streetlights or traffic. It looked abandoned, cracked windows, graffiti on the walls, weeds sprouting from the concrete lot. But when I pulled up at 7:55 p.m., the front door was open, a warm yellow glow spilling out. I wasn't alone. 3 other people stood by the entrance, looking just as confused as I felt. There was Lila, a 20-something artist with streaks of purple in her hair. Marcus, a quiet guy in his 40s with a nervous habit of fiddling with his watch. And Erica, a sharp-eyed woman in a business suit who looked like she didn't have time for nonsense. None of us knew each other, and none of us knew what to expect. But we all had the same flyer. At exactly 8 p.m., a voice crackled to life over a hidden speaker. "Welcome, participants," it said, smooth and artificial, like a high-end customer service bot. "You have 1 hour to escape. Work together. Or don't. The choice is yours." The door behind us slammed shut. The room we were in was surprisingly ordinary. A dimly lit office space with beige walls, mismatched furniture, and a single clock ticking loudly on the wall. There was a single sheet of paper on the desk, with the words, "Solve the puzzle. Find the key." Marcus spotted a locked cabinet in the corner and started rummaging through drawers for a clue. Lila poked at the painting on the wall, convinced it hid something. Erica crossed her arms, watching us like we were amateurs in her courtroom. "Check under the desk," she snapped at me. I rolled my eyes but crouched down anyway. Sure enough, there was a small note taped to the underside. "The time is the answer." I glanced at the clock. It read 8:12. "Try 8:12, I told Marcus, who was fiddling with the cabinet lock. It clicked open, revealing a single key. "That was fast," Lila said, her voice tinged with unease. Too fast, I thought. The key unlocked a door at the far end of the room, leading us into a long, narrow hallway. The walls were covered in old photographs, black and white portraits of strangers, their faces blurred or scratched out. "Okay, this is creepy," Lila muttered. The hallway led to a new room, darker than the first. This one was more elaborate. A Victorian parlor with red velvet chairs, heavy curtains, and a grandfather clock ticking ominously in the corner. There was another note on the table. "What you seek is hidden in plain sight, but beware what you awaken." "What does that mean?" Marcus asked, his voice shaky. Erica rolled her eyes. "It's just theatrics. Let's keep moving." As we searched the room, things started to feel off. The grandfather clock ticked erratically, sometimes stopping altogether. The portraits on the walls seemed to shift when I wasn't looking, their blurred faces turning toward me. And then Marcus screamed. We spun around to see him clutching his hand, blood dripping between his fingers. He tried to pry open a wooden chest, only to find a hidden spike inside. "Who the hell designs an escape room like this?" Erica snapped, but her voice wavered. "It's not just a game," Marcus muttered, his face pale. "Something's wrong." The grandfather clock let out a deafening chime, the sound reverberating through the room. When it stopped, the note on the table had changed. "One of you must stay." "What the hell?" Lila whispered. The air in the room grew heavier, colder. The portraits on the walls seemed to lean forward, their scratched-out faces impossibly close. "Is this part of the game?" Erica demanded, but no one answered. The lights flickered, and for a brief moment, the room was plunged into darkness. When they came back on, Marcus was gone. "Marcus!" I called out, my voice trembling, but there was no response, just silence. "We have to keep going," Erica said, her tone sharp with panic. "He probably left. Maybe there's an emergency exit." But Lila shook her head, her eyes wide. "He didn't leave. Did you see the way he just disappeared?" The next room was worse. The walls were covered in mirrors, each one reflecting distorted versions of ourselves. My reflection moved slightly out of sync, its eyes lingering on mine too long. The note in this room was smeared with something dark, almost like blood. "There's always a price." Before we could react, The mirrors began to ripple, like the glass was liquid. A hand shot out from one of them, clawed and pale, grabbing Lila by the wrist. She screamed, struggling as the hand pulled her closer to the mirror's surface. We tried to help, but it was like the air had turned solid, pressing us back. Within seconds, she was gone, her screams fading into silence. Erica and I stood there, frozen. "This isn't real," she whispered, her voice shaking. "This can't be real." But it was. The mirrors stilled, our reflections once again staring back at us. But now, there was something behind them, shadows, moving just out of reach. The final note was waiting for us in the center of the room. "Only one leaves." Erica turned to me, her face hardening. "I'm sorry," she said, and lunged at me. We fought, grappling in the eerie silence of the mirrored room. But I was faster, or maybe just more desperate. When it was over, I was alone. The exit door appeared, as if it had always been there. The warehouse was gone, replaced by an empty parking lot under the pale glow of a streetlight. I never saw Erica again. The $10,000 was deposited into my account the next day. I don't know who ran that escape room, or why they chose me, but sometimes, late at night, I catch my reflection moving in ways it shouldn't. And in the corner of my mirror, I can see them, Marcus, Lila, and Erica, watching, waiting. One morning, every clock in my house stopped, not at the same time. They each froze on different hours, as if time had gotten bored of being consistent. My alarm clock said 3:47 a.m. The microwave claimed it was 8:12. My watch? 6:06. But my phone, the one thing I trusted to stay grounded, still worked, so I shrugged it off. It was probably a power surge or something. Still, it left me feeling slightly untethered, like the day was out of sync before it even began. The next day, my kitchen window disappeared. It wasn't boarded up or blocked, it was just gone. The space where it should have been was a blank stretch of wall, smooth and seamless, like it had never been there at all. I stood in the kitchen for a long time, staring at the spot, trying to piece together what was happening. Had I been wrong? Had there ever been a window there? But I remembered the morning sun spilling through it, lighting up the counter where I made my coffee. I could even picture the way the light hit the plant I kept there, a little fern I hadn't watered in weeks. When I went to check on the fern, it was gone too. The rest of the day felt muted. The sounds of the world outside were quieter than usual, muffled like they were coming through thick glass. My neighbors' cars sat in their driveways, unmoving. The street lamps flickered even though it was midday. The air had a weight to it, thick and oppressive, and I found myself checking over my shoulder more often than I'd like to admit. Nothing was there, of course, but the feeling didn't leave. That night, I dreamed of a house. Not mine, but familiar in a way that made my stomach churn. The walls were tall, too tall, and the room seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. The windows were covered with thick curtains, and the air was heavy with the scent of something sweet and rotting. I wandered through the house, opening doors that led to empty rooms, staircases that spiraled upward but never seemed to end. Somewhere, far off, I heard a clock ticking. When I woke up, the clocks in my house were gone. Not stopped this time, just gone. The alarm clock, the microwave display, even the old cuckoo clock my grandmother had given me, all missing. The blank spaces they left behind made my skin crawl, as though the walls themselves had swallowed them whole. My phone still showed the time, but it felt less real now, like it was lying to me. I tried calling my sister, Claire. She was always the one who could make sense of things, the practical one who kept me grounded. But when I dialed her number, the line buzzed, and then a voice I didn't recognize answered. It was soft, almost childlike, and spoke with a deliberate slowness. "There's no one by that name here," it said. I checked the number 3 times. It was hers. The next time I looked outside, the world was darker. It wasn't nighttime, not exactly, but the sky had turned a deep gray, and the sunlight was weak and cold. The trees along my street were bare now, their branches twisted into shapes that didn't seem quite natural. The houses, once full of life, stood silent, their windows dark. I realized, with a cold, sinking feeling, that I hadn't seen another person all day. That's when the knocking started. It was soft at first, a faint tapping at the front door. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Something about it felt wrong. It wasn't hurried or frantic, the way someone might knock if they needed help. It was measured, deliberate, like whoever, or whatever. It was had all the time in the world. I didn't answer. Instead, I crept to the door and peeked through the peephole. The street outside was empty. No one was there. The knocking stopped, but when I turned around, there was a knock at the back door. The house didn't feel like mine anymore. The walls seemed closer, the ceilings lower. The air was thick, pressing against my skin, and every shadow seemed to ripple with movement just beyond the edges of my vision. I stayed up all night, clutching a kitchen knife, my eyes fixed on the doors and windows. But nothing else happened. The knocking didn't return. The next morning, I found a note on the kitchen counter. It hadn't been there before. I was certain of that. It was written in a thin, spidery hand on yellowed paper that smelled faintly of mold. "You're almost out of time." I didn't know what it meant, but the words sank into me, heavy and suffocating. I tried to leave the house then, but when I stepped outside, the street was gone. In its place was a dense, endless fog. I could barely see a few feet in front of me, and the silence was absolute. No wind, no birds, not even the distant hum of traffic. Just nothing. I went back inside. Where else could I go? The house had changed again. The walls were darker, the rooms smaller. Doors led to places they shouldn't. My bedroom closet opened into a narrow hallway I'd never seen before, lined with doors that didn't have handles. The kitchen sink dripped, but when I turned the faucet, no water came out. Instead, the dripping grew louder, faster, until it sounded like a waterfall roaring in my ears. I stopped trying to understand. All I could do was wait. For what? I didn't know. The clock came back that night. Just one, sitting in the middle of my living room floor. It was old, an antique thing with brass hands and a cracked glass face. The time on it was wrong, but I couldn't adjust it. The hands wouldn't move no matter how hard I tried. The ticking began at midnight. It was slow at first, each tick echoing through the house like a hammer on stone. Then it grew faster, louder. By dawn, it was a constant, deafening roar, and I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. I threw the clock against the wall, but it didn't break. It just kept ticking, louder and louder, and then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I don't know how long I've been here now. The days bleed together, and the house keeps shrinking. The walls are so close now that I can barely move, and the air is thick with that sickly sweet smell. The clock is still in the living room, ticking away even though its hands haven't moved in days. And every night, I hear the knocking again. It's closer now. Sometimes it's not at the doors anymore. Sometimes it's at the walls. Sometimes it's behind me. A stray showed up at my back door one evening, its matted fur caked with mud. I didn't have the heart to turn it away. It looked exhausted, ribs visible beneath its thin coat, and its big, dark eyes were desperate. I set out a bowl of water and some leftover chicken. It devoured the food so quickly I thought it might choke. It was raining that night, and I figured the dog could stay in the garage until morning. I even gave it an old blanket to curl up on. As I locked the door to the garage, it stared at me through the small window, those dark eyes unblinking, almost human. By morning, the dog was gone. The garage door was locked, just as I'd left it, but the blanket lay in a perfect circle on the floor, as if it had been folded and placed there intentionally. That should have been my first clue. The next night, I heard scratching at the back door again. I assumed the dog had returned, so I grabbed some scraps from the fridge and opened the door, but the porch was empty, just rain pooling in the cracks of the concrete. I stepped outside and called softly, "Here, boy," my breath visible in the chilly air. Nothing. I closed the door, feeling uneasy, and went back to the living room. But as I settled onto the couch, I heard the faintest sound, a low, guttural growl. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the house. I froze, my ears straining to locate the sound. The growl faded, replaced by the soft pad of footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling. My heart raced as I reached for my phone, but when I turned on the flashlight and scanned the room, there was nothing there. Just silence. The next morning, I found paw prints. Wet, muddy ones, trailing from the back door, through the kitchen, and disappearing near the staircase. I checked every corner of the house, but there was no sign of the dog, or anything else that could have made them. I told myself I must have tracked the mud inside without noticing. That seemed logical. But that night, the knocking started. It came around 2 a.m., loud and insistent, from somewhere deep inside the house. I jolted awake, my heart pounding. At first, I thought someone was at the front door, but as I crept downstairs, the sound seemed to shift. It was coming from the walls. I pressed my ear to the living room wall, and for a moment, I heard nothing. Then, faintly, a soft scratching, like nails dragging against wood. I didn't sleep after that. Over the next few days, the activity escalated. Doors creaked open on their own. Lights flickered. Once, I walked into the kitchen to find every cabinet door wide open, the dishes inside arranged in neat, concentric circles. I didn't want to believe it, but the signs were undeniable. Something was in my house, and it wasn't just a stray dog. On the fourth night, I set up my phone to record while I slept. I placed it on the dresser in my bedroom, pointed toward the bed, and hit record before turning off the lights. It made me feel a little better, like I was taking control of the situation. The next morning, I reviewed the footage. For most of the night, there was nothing but the sound of me shifting in bed, the occasional sigh, the creak of the old house settling. Then, at 3:12 a.m., the screen flickered and the audio cut out. When it returned, the angle of the camera had changed. The phone was now focused on the closet door. I stopped the video, my hands shaking. I didn't even want to look at the closet, but I forced myself to turn toward it. The door was slightly ajar. Just a crack. Just enough for someone, or something, to peer out. I grabbed my phone and ran out of the house, dialing the police as soon as I reached the driveway. They arrived within minutes, searched the house, and found no signs of an intruder. Probably just a prank, one of the officers said. Kids messing around. But as they left, I noticed the look the older cop gave me. The way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes darted to the house, like he wanted to say something but thought better of it. I didn't go back inside that night. I stayed at a motel on the edge of town, the first real sleep I'd had in days. But when I woke up, there was something waiting for me. A paw print, pressed perfectly into the pillow beside me. I moved out the next day, found a new apartment on the other side of town, left most of my things behind, unwilling to take anything that might have carried a piece of the house with it. For a while, things were quiet. No knocks, no scratches, no inexplicable paw prints. But then, 2 weeks later, I came home from work to find a package on my doorstep. No return address, no markings, just a plain cardboard box. Inside was a blanket, old and worn, with a muddy paw print stamped in the center. I never opened the door again. I was at a small bookstore downtown, the kind with creaky wooden floors and the smell of old paper hanging in the air. It wasn't the kind of place I normally visited, but I'd been drawn in by the window display, a stack of leather-bound journals with intricate, hand-painted designs. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just killing time. When I slipped my hand into my pocket and felt the paper, I pulled it out, expecting an old receipt or maybe a sticky note from work. Instead, it was a folded piece of thick, yellowed paper. There were words written on it in ink, the letters uneven and jagged, as though someone had scrawled them in a hurry. "Do not turn around." I froze, the words sinking in like a hook snagging deep in my chest. My first instinct was to look over my shoulder, but something about the note made me hesitate. My pulse quickened, and I clutched the paper tighter, feeling its texture against my fingertips. It wasn't just the message that unnerved me. It was the fact that I hadn't put the note there. This was my jacket, my pocket. How had it gotten inside? I forced myself to breathe. There was no one behind me, I told myself. It was just a prank, someone messing with me. But even as I tried to convince myself, I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. I folded the note and slipped it back into my pocket. Then, deliberately, I stepped forward and reached for a random book on the nearest shelf. I wasn't really looking at the title. I just needed something to do, something to focus on. But as I opened the book, my breath caught. The first page was blank, except for a single line of text in the same jagged handwriting. I said, "Don't turn around." My skin prickled, and the room seemed to tilt slightly, like the ground had shifted beneath me. Slowly, I closed the book and slid it back onto the shelf. I wanted to leave, to bolt out the door and never look back, but my feet wouldn't move. Instead, I heard myself say, "Who's there?" My voice sounded foreign, thin and trembling. The words hung in the air, unanswered, and the silence that followed was deafening. When I finally gathered the courage to turn around, the bookstore was empty. Not just empty of people, empty. The shelves were bare, the books gone. Even the counter at the front of the store, where the cashier had been moments ago, was stripped clean. The space was unrecognizable, the light dimmer than it had been before, casting long shadows across the floor. I stumbled toward the door, my legs feeling like lead. When I pushed it open, the air outside was sharp and cold, and the city felt wrong. The streets were deserted, the usual buzz of traffic and chatter replaced by an eerie stillness. Buildings loomed overhead, their windows dark and lifeless, like hollow eyes watching me. I checked my phone. No signal. The clock on the screen was frozen at 3:17 p.m., even though I knew it had been closer to 5 when I'd entered the store. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the note. I pulled it out again, half expecting the words to have changed. They hadn't. But this time, there was something else written beneath the first line. "You're running out of time." The words sent a shiver down my spine. I shoved the note back into my pocket and started walking. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to move. The silence was oppressive, each step echoing unnaturally loud against the pavement. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but every few steps, I felt it. The faint sensation of someone walking just behind me, their presence brushing against the edge of my awareness. I quickened my pace, refusing to look back. The city around me seemed to stretch and twist, the buildings taller than they should have been, their angles sharp and distorted. The streetlights flickered erratically, casting fleeting shadows that danced and writhed like living things. Finally, I reached an intersection where a single street lamp burned steadily, its light illuminating a small, black door set into the side of a brick building. There was no sign, no indication of what lay beyond it, but I felt drawn to it, as though the door were waiting for me. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Then, without fully understanding why, I pulled the note out one last time. The words had changed again. Inside. Quickly, my heart pounded as I turned the knob and stepped through the door. On the other side was a room that defied logic. It was vast, impossibly so, the walls stretching out into an endless darkness. The floor was made of smooth, black stone that seemed to ripple like water beneath my feet. In the center of the room stood a single table, and on it, an open book. The book's pages glowed faintly, and as I approached, I realized the text was moving, shifting and rearranging itself in real time. Words appeared and disappeared, sentences forming only to dissolve into nothingness. But one phrase remained constant, etched into the top of the page. "Write your name." I didn't want to. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and run, but something held me there. The book seemed to pulse with a strange energy, pulling me closer. A pen lay beside it, thin and silver, glinting in the faint light. My hand trembled as I picked up the pen. I stared at the blank line beneath the command, my mind racing. What would happen if I wrote my name? What would happen if I didn't? Before I could decide, a voice whispered from the darkness, low and hollow. "If you leave it blank, they'll find you." The pen felt heavy in my hand. Slowly, reluctantly, I bent over the book and wrote my name. The moment I finished the last letter, the ground beneath me vanished. I fell, the darkness swallowing me whole, the sound of the whispering voice growing louder, layered and endless. And then, I woke up. I was back in my apartment, the morning sun streaming through the windows. Everything was normal. My jacket hung on the back of a chair, the pockets empty. The note, the bookstore, the endless city. It was all gone, like a dream. But when I opened my laptop to start the day, I froze. The wallpaper on my screen had changed. It was a single line of text, written in jagged letters that I now recognized all too well. "We know your name." Same train, same time. Same tired crowd crammed into the same tired cars. I was scrolling through my phone, half listening to the robotic voice announcing the stops, when I noticed something strange. A man across from me was reading a newspaper. Not a big deal in itself. Plenty of people still do that. But the headline caught my eye. In bold letters, it read, "Local commuter notices something strange on train." I frowned, trying to read the article beneath the headline, but the print was too small. The man folded the paper suddenly, as if sensing my curiosity, and stood up to leave. When he exited at the next stop, I couldn't help but follow. Something about him felt off. The platform was nearly empty when I stepped off the train, save for the man, who was now walking briskly toward the escalators. I trailed a few steps behind, unsure what I was even doing. He didn't look back, didn't hesitate, just kept moving with the kind of determination that made my skin crawl. Then he stopped, dead in his tracks. "Are you going to follow me all the way home?" he asked without turning around. I froze. The air between us felt too still, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Before I could respond, he turned his head slightly, just enough for me to see a thin, knowing smile creep across his face. "Don't worry," he said, "you'll understand soon enough." And then he walked away, disappearing up the escalator. That should have been the end of it. I should have gone back to the platform, gotten on the next train, and forgotten the whole thing. But something about his tone, his words, stuck with me. They weren't threatening exactly, just certain, like he knew something I didn't. When I got home, the first thing I noticed was my phone buzzing on the counter. A notification from a news app. The headline, "Local commuter notices something strange on train." I dropped the phone like it had burned me. The article wasn't long, just a few sentences. A local commuter was seen following a man off the 7:15 train. Witnesses report unusual behavior. Authorities urge anyone with information to come forward. There was no byline, no publication name, nothing to indicate where it had come from. I shut off my phone and tried to convince myself it was some kind of elaborate prank. A coincidence. A glitch. But when I checked the notification again a few minutes later, it was gone, as if it had never existed. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the man's voice in my head. "You'll understand soon enough." The next day, things got stranger. On my way to work, the train felt different. The usual smells of old upholstery and sweat were replaced with a sharp, chemical tang. The lights flickered more than usual, and the announcements crackled like a dying radio. At one stop, the doors didn't open right away. The train just sat there, the air inside growing heavier with every passing second. When the doors finally slid apart, I noticed something chilling. The people waiting on the platform weren't moving. They were frozen mid-step, mid-conversation, like statues. Their faces were blank, their eyes empty. I blinked, and they started moving again, boarding the train like nothing had happened. No one else seemed to notice. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, but the unease in my chest grew with every stop. By the time I reached my office, my hands were shaking. Things didn't improve at work. My desk, usually cluttered with papers and post-it notes, was spotless. Too spotless. The pens were lined up perfectly, the keyboard pristine. When I checked my calendar, all my meetings had disappeared. Every single one. It was like I'd been erased. By lunchtime, I'd convinced myself I was losing it. I left the office and wandered aimlessly, ending up in a small park I didn't recognize. That's where I saw him again. The man from the train, sitting on a bench, reading another newspaper. He looked up as I approached, his smile sharp and knowing. "You're starting to notice," he said, folding the paper neatly. "Good. What the hell is going on?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He gestured to the bench beside him. Against my better judgment, I sat. "Think of it like a recalibration," he said, his tone casual, like we were discussing the weather. "Things get out of sync sometimes. People notice things they shouldn't. That's where I come in." "Out of sync? What are you talking about?" He leaned back, crossing one leg over the other. "You've been seeing the cracks, haven't you? The glitches. The little moments that don't quite add up." I thought about the frozen people, the strange train, the disappearing notification. What are they? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Artifacts, he said. Leftovers from previous iterations. The system tries to smooth them over, but sometimes it struggles. People like you, people who notice, make it harder. I stared at him, my pulse thundering in my ears. And what happens to people who notice? He tilted his head, studying me. Usually, they're reset, wiped clean. You'd be surprised how easy it is to erase a few days or a lifetime. I stood up, my heart racing. I'm not buying this. You're just messing with me. He shrugged, standing as well. Suit yourself, but don't say I didn't warn you. He walked away, disappearing into the crowd, and I was left standing there, unsure if I wanted to scream or cry. That night, I checked my phone obsessively, searching for proof that I wasn't imagining things. At 11:47 p.m., a notification appeared. System error detected. Recalibration in progress. The screen went black, and when it came back on, my phone had been wiped clean. No apps, no contacts, no photos. Just a single message on the lock screen. You'll understand soon enough. Now, every day feels wrong. My coworkers repeat the same conversations. The train always arrives at the same second, down to the millisecond. And the man, he's always there, somewhere in the crowd, watching, waiting. I'm afraid to sleep, afraid to wake up, afraid that one day, I'll look in the mirror and see someone else staring back. I was on my way home from a work trip, driving through a stretch of highway that cut through miles of empty farmland. The clock on my dash said 11:38 p.m., and I still had at least another hour to go. I'd been scanning through stations, trying to find something to keep me awake. Static, static, a country song, more static. Then, just as I was about to give up, a voice came through the speakers, calling all travelers on Route 23. Are you listening? It wasn't a station I recognized. The voice was calm, soothing, but there was something about it that made my skin prickle. I glanced at the radio display, but it didn't show any station number, just a series of dashes. Tonight is a special night, the voice continued, smooth as honey. A night for those of you who don't mind taking a detour. If you're interested, stay tuned. If not, keep driving. You'll forget all about this. I should have kept driving. I know I should have, but something about the voice held me. It felt like it was speaking directly to me, like it knew I was there, gripping the wheel, staring out at the empty road ahead. Before I realized it, my foot eased off the gas. Good, the voice said, and I nearly jumped. Turn off at the next exit. I told myself it was a coincidence. I was tired, and my mind was playing tricks on me. But when the exit appeared, a narrow, unmarked ramp leading into the dark, I took it. My headlights swept over an old, rusted sign, but I didn't catch what it said. The road was rough, full of potholes and lined with trees that pressed in close, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. My chest tightened, but the voice came back, soft and steady. Don't be afraid. You're almost there. Almost where? I muttered, but the radio didn't respond. Instead, the static crackled and faint music began to play. A waltz, slow and haunting, like something from an old music box. After what felt like forever, the road ended in a clearing. My headlights illuminated a single building, a diner. It looked like it had been plucked straight out of the 1950s, with its neon sign flickering weakly. Wayfarer's Rest, it read. Beneath it, the words always open glowed faintly. Against all better judgment, I parked. My hands were shaking as I cut the engine. I thought about turning back, but something compelled me to get out of the car. The air outside was thick, humid, and smelled faintly of burnt sugar. The music from the radio seemed to follow me as I approached the diner. Inside, it was brighter than I expected. The booths were upholstered in cracked red leather, and the linoleum floor was scuffed but clean. A jukebox in the corner played the same waltz I'd heard on the radio. The place was empty, except for the man behind the counter. He looked ordinary enough, mid-40s, with salt and pepper hair and a white apron tied over a plaid shirt. But his eyes were sharp, too sharp, and they seemed to take in more than they should. He smiled when he saw me. "Welcome," he said, his voice eerily familiar. "You've had a long journey." I didn't know what to say. My throat felt dry, and the words wouldn't come. Instead, I sat at the counter, my hands gripping the edge so tightly my knuckles turned white. The man placed a cup of coffee in front of me, though I hadn't asked for it. "On the house," he said. "I didn't drink it. What is this place?" I finally managed to ask. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he tilted his head, studying me like I was a puzzle he was trying to solve. "This is a crossroads," he said finally. "A place where paths converge." "Okay," I said slowly. "And what does that mean?" "It means," he said, "that you have a choice to make." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I looked around the diner. That's when I noticed the other patrons. At first, I thought the booths were empty, but as I looked closer, I saw them. Shadows, faint and flickering, like old film projections. Each booth held a figure, but their features were hazy, indistinct. One of them turned its head toward me, and even though I couldn't see its face, I felt its gaze like a weight pressing down on my chest. "What are they?" I whispered. "Travelers," the man said. "Like you." "I'm not like them," I said, my voice rising. "I don't belong here." He smiled again, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You wouldn't be here if you didn't." I stood up, my legs shaky. "I'm leaving." The man didn't try to stop me. "The road's always open," he said, "but so is the door." I didn't understand what he meant, and I didn't care. I practically ran back to my car, fumbling with the keys as I climbed in. The diner's neon sign flickered in my rearview mirror as I sped back down the road. But here's the thing. The road didn't end. I drove for hours, maybe longer, but the trees never thinned, and the potholes never stopped. The same waltz played faintly in the background, though I turned off the radio. Eventually, the road looped back to the clearing. The diner was still there, its lights glowing softly, waiting for me. I don't know how long I've been here now. Days? Weeks? Time doesn't seem to work the same way it used to. I've tried leaving, but the road always brings me back. And every time I return, the shadowy figures in the booths are clearer, their faces more distinct. This morning, when I walked inside, one of them smiled at me. There's a booth waiting for me now, in the far corner. I haven't sat down yet, but I can feel it pulling me, like gravity. The man behind the counter hasn't said anything this time. He doesn't need to. I think I know what my choice is, and I think I'm running out of time. A golden retriever, panting happily in the middle of the highway. I was driving home late one evening, the radio playing softly, when I saw it. The road was empty except for me and the dog, sitting squarely in the middle of the lane, wagging its tail like it was waiting for something. I slammed on the brakes, my heart lurching. The car skidded to a stop just feet away. The dog didn't flinch. It didn't move at all, actually, not even to blink. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, unsure of what to do. Then, slowly, it tilted its head to one side, as if it were studying me. I could have sworn I saw its tail wagging in perfect rhythm with the ticking of my car's hazard lights. I rolled down the window. "Hey, buddy," I called out, my voice shaky. "What are you doing here?" The dog didn't respond, of course, but something about the way it looked at me sent a shiver crawling down my spine. Its eyes were too still, too knowing. I opened the car door, stepping out cautiously, and that's when it happened. The dog stood up, turned, and walked away, straight into the forest lining the road. Not trotting, not bounding like you'd expect a dog to do. Just walking, deliberate, calm. I don't know what possessed me to follow it, but I did. Maybe it was the eerie stillness of the night, or the way the trees seemed to lean in closer as I stepped off the road. Maybe it was the fact that the dog, with its golden fur glowing faintly in the moonlight, never looked back. It didn't need to. It knew I'd come. The forest was darker than I expected, the air heavy and damp. I stumbled over roots and rocks, trying to keep up. "Hey," I called after the dog. "Where are you going?" It didn't stop. It just kept walking, its tail wagging in that same unnatural rhythm. Finally, it led me to a clearing. The moonlight spilled down, casting long shadows over the grass. In the center of the clearing was a door. Just a door, freestanding, with no walls to hold it up. It was old and wooden, with peeling white paint and a tarnished brass handle. The dog sat in front of it, looking at me expectantly. "What is this?" I whispered, stepping closer. My breath puffed out in the chilly air. The dog wagged its tail once, then twice, and the door creaked open on its own. Beyond the door, there was no forest, no clearing, no night sky, just a void, a swirling mass of colors and shapes that made my head hurt to look at. It was like staring into a broken kaleidoscope, endless and shifting. "Nope," I said, backing away. "No, thank you. I'm not." The dog barked, sharp and loud, cutting me off. It was the first sound it had made all night. It stood, stepping closer to me, its gaze locked onto mine. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers. My heart raced. "You want me to go in there?" I asked, my voice trembling. The dog barked again, against every ounce of common sense I had. I stepped closer to the door. The air around it was warm, almost buzzing, like static electricity. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and touched the edge of the frame. The world tilted. I fell forward, tumbling through the door, and the forest vanished. When I hit the ground, I was somewhere else entirely. The air was thick and golden, shimmering like liquid light. The landscape stretched out in every direction, rolling hills covered in grass that shifted colors with the wind, from green to blue to purple. Above me, the sky was alive, a swirling canvas of stars and constellations that rearranged themselves every few seconds. And standing in front of me was the dog. Only now, it wasn't a dog. It had changed. It stood on two legs, its body taller, more humanoid. Its fur rippled like silk, and its glowing eyes burned brighter. Its mouth didn't move, but I heard its voice in my head, clear and commanding. "You came," it said. What is this place?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "This is between," it replied. "A crack in the world, a seam where realities touch." I stared at it, trying to process what it was saying. "Why did you bring me here?" Its head tilted, the way it had on the road. "Because you noticed, and because we need you." "Need me? For what?" "To fix the cracks," it said simply. Before I could respond, the ground beneath us shifted. A jagged line appeared in the grass, splitting the earth open. Beyond the crack, I saw something dark and hungry, a void that writhed and pulsed, spilling shadows into the golden light. The knot dog raised a hand, or a paw, or whatever it had, and the crack sealed itself with a snap. "You are one of us now," it said, turning back to me. "You will see the cracks, and you will mend them." "I didn't agree to this," I shouted. "It doesn't matter," it replied. "You are here. You are chosen." Before I could argue, the ground tilted again, and I fell. I woke up in my car, parked on the side of the highway. The dog was gone, the forest was quiet, and the sky was just starting to turn pink with dawn. I could have convinced myself it was a dream, except for the crack in the pavement in front of me, faint and shimmering. And I knew, somehow, that more were coming. I was sitting in traffic on the way home from work, half listening to some true crime podcast, when my phone buzzed with the notification. One new voicemail. Strange, since my phone hadn't even rung. It wasn't from a number I recognized either, just a string of zeros that didn't look like any phone number I'd ever seen. Curiosity got the better of me, so I played it. At first, there was only static, a faint crackling like an old record player. Then a voice cut through, low, shaky, and so quiet I had to press the phone to my ear to make it out. "You shouldn't have been there." I frowned. "Been where?" I muttered to myself. The voice continued, broken up by bursts of static. "It's watching now. You need to." The recording ended abruptly. No name, no callback number, no explanation. Just a vague, cryptic warning. I chalked it up to a prank. Maybe someone misstyled. Or maybe it was one of those creepy promotional stunts for a movie or something. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I'd almost forgotten about it. That was the first mistake. My house felt off that night, though I couldn't put my finger on why. Nothing was out of place. No strange noises or signs of a break-in. But the air felt heavier somehow, like it was pressing down on me. I tried to shake it off as I made dinner and scrolled mindlessly on my phone, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Around midnight, just as I was about to head to bed, my phone buzzed again. One new voicemail. This time, I hadn't even touched the phone all evening. I played it, and the same voice came through, sharper now, more insistent. It knows. It's in your shadow. A cold chill ran down my spine. I turned, glancing at the walls, the corners of the room, but everything looked normal. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I barely slept that night, every sound making me jolt awake. The next morning, I called my phone provider, asking if they could trace the number or block it. The guy on the other end sounded bored, like he'd dealt with paranoid customers before. "The number's not showing up in our system," he said. "Could be spam, but doesn't really match anything I've seen." "Then block it," I snapped. He sighed. "Sure, done." For the rest of the day, I kept looking over my shoulder. At the office, I kept thinking I saw someone standing just out of the corner of my vision, only to turn and find nothing there. By the time I got home, I was a wreck. And then I saw the package on my doorstep. It was a plain box, unmarked, with no return address. My name was scrawled across the top in the same shaky handwriting I'd heard in the voicemail. I hesitated for a long moment before picking it up. It was light, almost empty. Inside was a single object, an old Polaroid photo. It showed the street in front of my house, taken from what looked like the view of my front porch. The angle was low, like the photo had been snapped from ground level, and the timestamp in the corner was dated 3 days ago. In the foreground, there was a shadow stretching toward the camera, but there was no person casting it. I dropped the photo like it had burned me and slammed the door shut. I checked the locks twice and pulled the curtains closed. That night, the phone buzzed again. I didn't want to listen to the voicemail, but I couldn't help myself. My hand moved almost on its own, playing the message. "You brought it back," the voice hissed. "You can't hide from it now." "Hide from what?" I whispered aloud, my voice trembling. The voicemail ended with a sound I couldn't place, a deep, guttural noise, like the grinding of metal against stone. I didn't sleep at all. The next day, I skipped work and drove 2 towns over, tossing the Polaroid and my phone into a dumpster behind a gas station. I bought a cheap prepaid phone, thinking I'd finally rid myself of whatever was happening. When I got home, I found another Polaroid taped to my door. This one showed the inside of my house, my living room, specifically. The shadow from the first photo was in the same spot, only now it was closer. I didn't go inside. I drove straight to a motel and locked myself in for the night. The phone buzzed at 3:33 a.m. This time, I didn't even need to check the screen to know it was another voicemail. I played it on speaker, my hands trembling. "Run," the voice said, "but it'll follow. It always does." I turned on every light in the motel room and sat against the wall, knife in hand, staring at the door until dawn. That was last night. This morning, I woke up to find another Polaroid slipped under the motel room door. It showed me, sitting against the wall, clutching the knife, bathed in the motel's harsh fluorescent light. The shadow was standing right behind me. I didn't feel it then. I do now. I first noticed the writing 3 days after I moved in. The apartment wasn't much, just a 1-bedroom in a crumbling brownstone on the edge of the city. Cheap, drafty, and perpetually bathed in a strange, dim light no matter the time of day. But it was all I could afford, and I needed to get out of my old place fast. This apartment, with its creaking floors and faint mildew smell, felt like freedom. The writing was on the inside of the bathroom cabinet door. It was faint, barely visible, as though someone had scrawled it in pencil decades ago. At first, I thought it was just a stray mark or some forgotten shopping list left behind by the previous tenant. But when I leaned closer, I saw it was a name, Lena. It didn't bother me at first. In fact, I barely gave it a second thought. But over the next few days, I started noticing more of the writing, little marks in places that didn't make sense. A date etched into the underside of the kitchen counter, October 4th, 1989. A single word, scratched faintly into the baseboard in the bedroom, "Run." I told myself it was nothing. Old apartments had quirks, right? People lived here before me. People left things behind. But the marks didn't feel random. They felt deliberate, placed, like someone had been trying to leave messages for whoever came next. The first night I truly felt uneasy. I was brushing my teeth. It was late, and the silence in the apartment was thick and heavy, pressing against my ears. As I spat into the sink and reached for a towel, I saw it. New writing, where there hadn't been any before. "Do not open the closet." The words were scrawled across the bathroom mirror in what looked like condensation, though I hadn't used the shower and the room wasn't steamy. My stomach tightened, and I whipped around, expecting to see someone behind me, but I was alone. I stared at the mirror for what felt like forever, waiting for the words to fade, but they didn't. They lingered, as if they'd been written from inside the glass. I barely slept that night. By the next morning, the writing was gone. The mirror was clean, no trace of the message anywhere. I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it. Maybe I was just stressed. A new place, new surroundings. It was normal to feel a little off. But as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something in the apartment had shifted. The air felt colder, heavier. The lights seemed dimmer, no matter how many lamps I turned on. And then, there was the closet. It was in the bedroom, a small, unassuming thing with a flimsy wooden door. I hadn't given it much thought. I'd thrown some clothes and a few boxes in there on move-in day and hadn't opened it since. But now, it seemed different. Bigger, somehow, or darker. The air near it felt colder, as if the space inside wasn't quite connected to the rest of the room. I didn't open it. That night, I woke to a sound. A faint, rhythmic creak, like the hinges of a door being moved ever so slightly. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, and it was coming from the bedroom. My heart pounded as I sat up, eyes locked on the closet door. It wasn't open, but it wasn't entirely closed either. The gap was small, no more than an inch, but I could see the darkness inside, and I could feel it looking back at me. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen. The creaking stopped, and the silence that followed was worse, thick and suffocating, stretching out until I thought I might scream just to break it. And then, a whisper, soft, so faint I wasn't sure I'd heard it at all. "Lena." I bolted from the room, slamming the bedroom door behind me. I spent the rest of the night on the couch, every light in the apartment blazing. I wanted to leave, to get out, but where would I go? I had no family nearby, no friends in the city, and the thought of opening the front door in the dark terrified me even more than staying put. The next morning, I decided to call the landlord. Maybe there was some explanation for all of this, an old tenant with a grudge, or some elaborate prank. But when I asked about the closet, his tone changed. He didn't laugh off my concerns or brush me off like I'd expected. Instead, there was a long pause, and then he said, very quietly, "Don't go in there." That was all. He hung up before I could ask anything else. By the time the sun set, I had resolved to leave. I didn't care about the deposit or my belongings. I packed a bag, grabbed my keys, and headed for the door. But as I reached for the handle, I heard it again. The whisper, "Lena." It wasn't coming from the closet this time. It was coming from behind me. Slowly, I turned, and the air around me grew impossibly cold. The writing was back. This time, it covered the walls, the ceiling, every surface of the apartment. She was never in the closet. The lights flickered, and the room plunged into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, the flashlight beam cutting through the black. It landed on the bedroom door, which was now wide open. The closet door, too, stood ajar, the darkness inside so deep it seemed to swallow the light. And then, she stepped out. She wasn't human. Not anymore. Her limbs were too long, her face a pale, featureless mask. But the worst part was her hands, bony, clawed things, reaching for me as she whispered my name. I ran. I don't remember locking the door behind me or getting into my car. I just drove, as far and as fast as I could. I'm writing this from a motel 3 towns over. The bag I packed is gone. My phone keeps buzzing with missed calls from an unknown number. Every time I check, there's a single text waiting for me. "Lena." I don't know who she is, but I think she's coming for me. I'd come home from work like any other day, groceries in one hand, keys in the other. But when I slid the key into the lock and turned it, The door wouldn't budge. It wasn't stuck. It felt like something heavy was pressed against it from the inside. "Great," I muttered, setting the groceries down and trying again. Same result. I even tried leaning my shoulder against it, but it didn't give an inch. Finally, I gave up and called the building manager. 15 minutes later, Tony showed up, a lanky guy with a perpetually tired expression. He jiggled the key in the lock, fiddled with it a bit, then turned to me with a shrug. "It's not locked," he said. "You sure it's your door?" I blinked at him. Of course it's my door. Apartment 307. My stuff is in there. Tony scratched his head, clearly unimpressed. "Let me see." He gave the door a hard shove with his shoulder, and just like that, it swung open easily, as though nothing had been wrong. I felt a mix of relief and embarrassment, until I saw the inside of the apartment. It wasn't mine. The layout was the same, sure, but everything else was different. The walls were painted a deep red instead of beige. The furniture was all wrong. Sleek black leather couches, glass tables, art on the walls that looked like it belonged in a gallery. There was even a grand piano in the corner, something I definitely didn't own. Tony whistled low. "Nice place. You redecorate?" "This isn't my stuff," I said, my voice rising. "Where's my stuff?" Tony frowned, stepping inside and looking around. "What are you talking about? This is apartment 307. Has been for years. Look, your name's on the door." He pointed to the brass nameplate outside. Sure enough, there it was. Emma Price. My name. My apartment. But none of it was mine. I stumbled into the living room, half expecting someone to jump out and yell surprise. No one did. Instead, I noticed something on the coffee table, a framed photo of a woman who looked exactly like me, sitting beside a man I'd never seen before. They were laughing, arms wrapped around each other. The frame felt cold in my hands as I stared at it. "Is that you?" Tony asked, peering over my shoulder. "No," I whispered, but my voice wavered. It was me, my face, my smile, but I had no memory of the man, no memory of this moment. Tony scratched his head again. "Look, I don't know what to tell you. You sure you're not messing with me?" I wasn't. I wished I was. "Maybe someone's playing a prank," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Or you're just stressed. I've heard of people losing it, you know? Stress can mess with your head." I wanted to argue, to tell him how ridiculous that sounded, but my voice failed me. He gave me one last puzzled look, then left, muttering something about calling him if I needed help. Once he was gone, I began searching the apartment. I pulled open drawers, flung open closets, checked every room for something, anything that would prove this wasn't real. But everything was in its place. Someone's place, not mine. The bathroom mirror was the final straw. When I looked into it, my reflection was smiling. I wasn't. I staggered back, nearly tripping over the edge of the rug. My reflection stayed where it was, smiling serenely, as though amused by my panic. Then, slowly, it tilted its head, like a curious animal. "Who are you?" I whispered, though I wasn't sure who I was asking, myself or the thing in the mirror. The reflection didn't answer. It just kept smiling. I fled the apartment. My legs carried me down the hall, down the stairs, out into the street before I even realized what I was doing. The cold night air burned my lungs, but I didn't stop running until I was halfway across town. Eventually, I found myself at a cheap motel. The room was grimy, the sheets stiff, but I didn't care. I locked the door, shoved a chair under the handle, and spent the night staring at the TV without really watching it. The next morning, I tried calling my friends, my family, anyone who could confirm I existed. Most of the numbers didn't work, just an endless beep or a robotic voice telling me the line was disconnected. The few that did connect were even worse. People answered, but they didn't know who I was. My own mother sounded confused when I said my name, insisting she didn't have a daughter. By the third day, I was desperate enough to go back to the apartment. The building looked the same, but when I reached my floor, my door wasn't there. Apartment 307 was gone, replaced by a wall of smooth plaster as if it had never existed. I asked Tony about it, but he didn't recognize me. He said he'd never seen me before in his life. "Look," he said, his tone apologetic but firm. "You must be mistaken. There's number 307 here. Hasn't been for years." I left before he could call security. That night, I found another note waiting for me in my motel room. It was written in my handwriting. "You're almost there. Don't stop now." I stared at the note for a long time, my hands trembling. Then I noticed something odd about the mirror above the motel sink. It wasn't my reflection staring back at me. It was the woman from the photo, the one who looked like me but wasn't. She wasn't smiling anymore. She was crying.